Chapter 21 Thebes Part 1 We had so long been the sport of destiny that we hardly knew what to make of our good fortune when 2 days of sweet south wind carried us from Edfu to Luxor. We came back to find the old mooring place alive with dahabiyas, and gay with English and American colours. These two flags well nigh divide the river. In every 25 boats, one may fairly calculate upon an average of 12 English, 9 American, 2 German, 1 Belgian, and 1 French. Of all of these, our American cousins, ever helpful, ever cordial, are pleasantest to meet. Their flag stands to me for a host of brave and generous and kindly associations. It brings back memories of many lands and many faces. It calls up echoes of friendly voices, some far distant, some, alas, silent. Wherefore, be it on the Nile or the Thames, or the high seas, or among Syrian camping grounds, or drooping listlessly from the balconies of gloomy diplomatic haunts in continental cities, my heart warms to the stars and stripes whenever I see them. Our arrival brought all the dealers of Luxor to the surface. They waylaid and followed us wherever we went, while some of the better sort, grave men in long black robes and ample turbans, installed themselves on our lower deck, and lived there for a fortnight. Go upstairs when one would, whether before breakfast in the morning or after dinner in the evening, there we always found them, patient, imperturbable, ready to rise up and salaam and produce from some hidden pocket a purse full of scarabs or a bundle of funerary statuettes. Some of these gentlemen were Arabs, some Copts, all polite, plausible, and mendacious. Where Copt and Arab drive the same doubtful trade, it is not easy to define the shades of difference in their dealings. As workmen, the Copts are perhaps the more artistic. As salesmen, the Arabs are perhaps the less dishonest. Both sell more forgeries than genuine antiquities. Be the demand what it may, they are prepared to meet it. Tutmos is not too heavy, nor Cleopatra too light for them. Their carvings in old sycamore wood, their porcelain statuettes, their hieroglyphed limestone tablets, are executed with a skill that almost defies detection. As for genuine scarabs of the highest antiquity, they are turned out by the gross every season. Engraved, glazed, and administered to the turkeys in the form of baluses, they acquire by the simple process of digestion a degree of venerableness that is really charming. Side by side with the work of production goes on the work of excavation. The professed diggers colonize the western bank. They live rent-free among the tombs, drive donkeys or work shadoofs by the day, and spend their nights searching for treasure. Some hundreds of families live in this grim way, spoiling the dead and gone Egyptians for a livelihood. Forgers, diggers, and dealers play meanwhile into one another's hands, and drive a roaring trade. Your dahabiya, as I have just shown, is beset from the moment you moor till the moment you pole off again from shore. The boy who drives your donkey, the guide who pilots you among the tombs, the half-naked fellah who flings down his hoe as you pass and runs beside you for a mile across the plain, have one and all an antika to dispose of. The turbaned official who comes, attended by his secretary and pipe-bearer, to pay you a visit of ceremony, warns you against imposition, and hints at genuine treasures to which he alone possesses the key. The gentlemanly native who sits next to you at dinner has a wonderful scarab in his pocket. In short, every man, woman, and child about the place is bent on selling a bargain, and the bargain, in 99 cases out of 100, is valuable in so far as it represents the industry of Luxor, but no farther. A good thing, of course, is to be had occasionally, but the good thing never comes to the surface as long as a market can be found for the bad one. It is only when the dealer finds he has to do with an inexperienced customer that he produces the best he has. Flourishing as it is, the trade of Luxor labors, however, under some uncomfortable restrictions. Private excavation being prohibited, the digger lives in dread of being found out by the governor. The forger, who has nothing to fear from the governor, lives in dread of being found out by the tourist. As for the dealer, whether he sells an antique or an imitation, he is equally liable to punishment. In the one case he commits an offence against the state, and in the other he obtains money under false pretences. Meanwhile, the governor deals out such even-handed justice as he can, and does his best to enforce the law on both sides of the river. By a curious accident, L. and the writer once actually penetrated into a forger's workshop. Not knowing that it had been abolished, we went to a certain house in which a certain consulate had once upon a time been located, and there knocked for admission. An old deaf fellaha opened the door, and after some hesitation showed us into a large, unfurnished room with 3 windows. In each window there stood a workman's bench strewn with scarabs, amulets, and funerary statuettes in every stage of progress. We examined these specimens with no little curiosity. Some were of wood, some were of limestone, some were partly coloured. The colours and brushes were there, to say nothing of files, gravers, and little pointed tools like gimlets. A magnifying glass of the kind used by engravers lay in one of the window recesses. We also observed a small grindstone screwed to one of the benches and worked by a treadle, while a massive fragment of mummy case in a corner behind the door showed whence came the old sycamore wood for the wooden specimens. That 3 skilled workmen furnished with European tools had been busy in this room shortly before we were shown into it was perfectly clear. We concluded that they had just gone away to breakfast. Meanwhile we waited, expecting to be ushered into the presence of the consul. In about 10 minutes, however, breathless with hurrying, arrived a well-dressed Arab whom we had never seen before. Distracted between his oriental politeness and his desire to get rid of us, he bowed us out precipitately, explaining that the house had changed owners and that the power in question had ceased to be represented at Luxor. We heard him rating the old woman savagely as soon as the door had closed behind us. I met that well-dressed Arab a day or 2 later, near the governor's house, and he immediately vanished round the nearest corner. The Bulak authorities keep a small gang of trained excavators always at work in the necropolis of Thebes. These men are superintended by the governor, and every mummy case discovered is forwarded to Bulak unopened. Thanks to the courtesy of the governor, we had the good fortune to be present one morning at the opening of a tomb. He sent to summon us just as we were going to breakfast. With what alacrity we manned the felucca, and how we ate our bread and butter, half in the boat and half on donkey back, may easily be imagined. How well I remember that early morning ride across the western plain of Thebes, the young barley rippling for miles in the sun, the little water channel running beside the path, the white butterflies circling in couples, the wayside grave with its tiny dolmen prayer mat, its well and broken cullah, inviting the passer-by to drink and pray, the wild vine that trailed along the wall, the vivid violet of the vetches that blossomed unbidden in the barley. We had the mounds and pylons of Medinet Habu to the left, the ruins of the Ramesseum to the right, the colossi of the plain and the rosy western mountains before us all the way. How the great statues glistened in the morning light! How they towered up against the soft blue sky! Battered and featureless, they sat in the old patient attitude, looking as if they mourned the vanished springs. We found the new tomb a few hundred yards in the rear of the Ramesseum. The diggers were in the pit, the governor and a few Arabs were looking on. The vault was lined with brickwork above, and cut square in the living rock below. We were just in time, for already, through the sand and rubble with which the grave had been filled in, there appeared an outline of something buried. The men, throwing spades and picks aside, now began scraping up the dust with their hands, and a mummy case gradually came to light. It was shaped to represent a body lying at length with the hands crossed upon the breast. Both hands and face were carved in high relief. The ground color of the sarcophagus was white, the surface covered with hieroglyph legends and somewhat coarsely painted figures of the 4 lesser gods of the dead. The face, like the hands, was colored a brownish yellow and highly varnished. But for a little dimness of the gaudy hues, and a little flaking off of the surface here and there, the thing was as perfect as when it was placed in the ground. A small wooden box roughly put together lay at the feet of the mummy. This was taken out first, and handed to the governor, who put it aside without opening it. The mummy case was then raised upright, hoisted to the brink of the pit, and laid upon the ground. It gave one a kind of shock to see it first of all lying just as it had been left by the mourners, then hauled out by rude hands to be searched, unrolled, perhaps broken up as unworthy to occupy a corner in the Bullock collection. Once they are lodged and catalogued in a museum, one comes to look upon these things as specimens, and forgets that they were once living beings like ourselves. But this poor mummy looked startlingly human and pathetic lying at the bottom of its grave in the morning sunlight. After the sarcophagus had been lifted out, a small blue porcelain cup, a ball of the same material, and another little object shaped like a cherry were found in the débris. The last was hollow, and contained something that rattled when shaken. The mummy, the wooden box, and these porcelain toys were then removed to a stable close by, and the excavators, having laid bare what looked like the mouth of a bricked-up tunnel in the side of the tomb, fell to work again immediately. A second vault, perhaps a chain of vaults, it was thought would now be discovered. We went away, meanwhile, for a few hours, and saw some of the famous painted tombs in that part of the mountainside just above, which goes by the name of Sheikh Abd el-Qurna. It was a hot climb, the sun blazing overhead, the cliffs reflecting light and heat, the white débris glaring underfoot. Some of the tombs here are excavated in terraces, and look from a distance like rows of pigeon-holes. Others are pierced in solitary ledges of rock. Many are difficult of access, all are intolerably hot and oppressive. They were numbered half a century ago by the late Sir Gardner Wilkinson, and the numbers are still there. We went that morning into 14, 16, 17, and 35. As a child, the manners and customs of the ancient Egyptians had shared my affections with the Arabian Nights. I had read every line of the old 6-volume edition over and over again. I knew every one of the 600 illustrations by heart. Now I suddenly found myself in the midst of old and half-forgotten friends. Every subject on these wonderful walls was already familiar to me. Only the framework, only the coloring, only the sand underfoot, only the mountain slope outside were new and strange. It seemed to me that I had met all these kindly brown people years and years ago, perhaps in some previous stage of existence, that I had walked with them in their gardens, listened at the music of their lutes and tambourines, pledged them at their feasts. Here is the funeral procession that I know so well, and the trial scene after death, where the mummy stands upright in the presence of Osiris, and sees his heart weighed in the balance. Here is that well-remembered old fowler crouching in the rushes with his basket of decoys. One withered hand is lifted to his mouth, his lips frame the call, his thin hair blows in the breeze. I see now that he has placed himself to the leeward of the game, but that subtlety escaped me in the reading days of my youth. Yonder I recognize a sculptor's studio into which I frequently peeped at that time. His men are at work as actively as ever, but I marvel that they have not yet finished polishing the surface of that red granite colossus. This patient angler, still waiting for a bite, is another old acquaintance, and yonder, I declare, is that evening party at which I was so often an imaginary guest. Is the feast not yet over? Has that late comer whom we saw hurrying along just now in a neighbouring corridor not yet arrived? Will the musicians never play to the end of their concerto? Are those ladies still so deeply interested in the patterns of one another's earrings? It seems to me that the world has been standing still in here for these last 35 years. Did I say 35? Ah me! I think we must multiply it by 10, and then by 10 again, ere we come to the right figure. These people lived in the time of the Thutmose and the Amenhoteps, a time upon which Rameses the Great looked back as we look back to the days of the Tudors and Stuarts. From the tombs above we went back to the excavations below. The bricked-up opening had led, as the diggers expected, into a second vault, and another mummy case, half crushed by a fall of débris, had just been taken out. A third was found later in the afternoon. Curiously enough, they were all 3 mummies of women. The governor was taking his luncheon with the first mummy in the recesses of the stable, which had been a fine tomb once, but reeked now with manure. He sat on a rug, cross-legged, with a bowl of sour milk before him and a tray of most uninviting little cakes. He invited me to a seat on his rug, handed me his own spoon, and did the honours of the stable as pleasantly as if it had been a palace. I asked him why the excavators, instead of working among these second-class graves, were not set to search for the tombs of the kings of the 18th dynasty, supposed to be waiting discovery in a certain valley called the Valley of the West. He shook his head. The way to the Valley of the West, he said, was long and difficult. Men working there must encamp upon the spot, and merely to supply them with water would be no easy matter. He was allowed, in fact, only a sum sufficient for the wages of 50 excavators, and to attack the Valley of the West with less than 200 would be useless. Chapter 21. Thebes, Part 2. We had luncheon that morning, I remember, with the M.B.s in the second hall of the Ramesseum. It was but one occasion among many, for the writer was constantly at work on that side of the river, and we had luncheon in one or another of the western temples every day. Yet that particular meeting stands out in my memory apart from the rest. I see the joyous party gathered together in the shade of the great columns, the Persian rugs spread on the uneven ground, the dragoman in his picturesque dress going to and fro, the brown and tattered Arabs squatting a little way off, silent and hungry-eyed, each with his string of forged scarabs, his imitation gods, or his bits of mummy case and painted cartonnage for sale, the glowing peeps of landscape framed here and there through vistas of columns, the emblazoned architraves laid along from capital to capital overhead, each block sculptured with enormous cartouches, yet brilliant with vermilion and ultramarine. The patient donkeys munching all together at a little heap of vetches in one corner, the intense depths of cloudless blue above. Of all the Theban ruins, the Ramesseum is the most cheerful. Drenched in sunshine, the warm limestone of which it is built seems to have mellowed and turned golden with time. No walls enclose it. No towering pylons overshadow it. It stands high, and the air circulates freely among these simple and beautiful columns. There are not many Egyptian ruins in which one can talk and be merry, but in the Ramesseum one may thoroughly enjoy the passing hour. Whether Rameses the Great was ever actually buried in this place is a problem which future discoveries may possibly solve. But that the Ramesseum and the tomb of Ozymandias were one and the same building is a point upon which I never entertained a moment's doubt. Spending day after day among these ruins, sketching now here, now there, going over the ground bit by bit, and comparing every detail, I came at last to wonder how an identity so obvious could ever have been doubted. Diodorus was of course inaccurate, but then one as little looks for accuracy in Diodorus as in Homer. Compared with some of his topographical descriptions, the account he gives of the Ramesseum is a marvel of exactness. He describes a building approached by 2 vast courtyards, a hall of pillars opening by way of 3 entrances from the second courtyard, a succession of chambers, including a sacred library, ceilings of azure bespangled with stars, walls covered with sculptures representing the deeds and triumphs of the king whom he calls Ozymandias, among which are particularly noticed the assault of a fortress environed by a river, a procession of captives without hands, and a series of all the gods of Egypt, to whom the king was represented in the act of making offerings. Finally, against the entrance to the second courtyard, 3 statues of the king, one of which, being of syenite granite and made in a sitting posture, is stated to be not only the greatest in all Egypt, but admirable above all others for its workmanship and the excellence of the stone. Bearing in mind that what is left of the Ramesseum is, as it were, only the backbone of the entire structure, one can still walk from end to end of the building, and still recognize every feature of this description. We turn our backs on the wrecked towers of the first propylon. Crossing what was once the first courtyard, we leave to the left the fallen colossus. We enter the second courtyard, and see before us the 3 entrances to the Hall of Pillars, and the remains of 2 other statues. We walk up the central avenue of the great hall, and see above our heads architraves studded with yellow stars upon a ground colour so luminously blue that it almost matches the sky. Thence, passing through a chamber lined with sculptures, we come to the library, upon the door jambs of which Champollion found the figures of Thoth and Sav, the Lord of Letters and the Lady of the Sacred Books. Finally, among such fragments of sculptured decoration as yet remain, we find the king making offerings to a hieroglyphed list of gods as well as to his deified ancestors. We see the train of captives and the piles of severed hands, and we discover an immense battle-piece, which is in fact a replica of the famous battle-piece at Abu Simbel. This subject, like its Nubian prototype, yet preserved some of its colour. The enemy are shown to be fair-skinned and light-haired, and wear the same Syrian robes, and the river, more green than at Abu Simbel, is painted in zigzags in the same manner. The king, alone in his chariot, sends arrow after arrow against the flying foe. They leap into the river and swim for their lives. Some are drowned, some cross in safety, and are helped out by their friends on the opposite bank. A red-haired chief, thus rescued, is suspended head downwards by his soldiers, in order to let the water that he has swallowed run out of his mouth. The river is once more the Orontes, the city is once more Kadesh, the king is once more Ramesses II, and the incidents are again the incidents of the poem of Pentar. The one wholly unmistakable point in the narrative is, however, the colossal statue of Sinite, the largest in Egypt. The siege and the river, the troops of captives are to be found elsewhere, but nowhere save here, a colossus which answers to that description. This statue was even larger than the twin colossi of the plain. They measure 18 feet and 3 inches across the shoulders. This measures 22 feet and 4 inches. They sit about 50 feet high without their pedestals. This one must have lifted his head some 10 feet higher still. The measure of his foot, says Diodorus, exceeded 7 cubits, the Greek cubit being a little over 18 inches in length. The foot of the fallen Ramesses measures nearly 11 feet in length by 4 feet 10 inches in breadth. This also is the only very large Theban colossus sculptured in the red syenite of Aswan. Ruined almost beyond recognition as it is, one never doubts for a moment that this statue was one of the wonders of Egyptian workmanship. It most probably repeated in every detail the colossi of Abu Simbel, but it surpassed them as much in finish of carving as in perfection of material. The stone is even more beautiful in colour than that of the famous obelisks of Karnak, and is so close and hard in grain that the scarab cutters of Luxor are said to use splinters of it, as our engravers use diamonds, for the points of their engraving tools. The solid contents of the whole, when entire, are calculated at 887 tons. How this astonishing mass was transported from Aswan, how it was raised, how it was overthrown, are problems upon which a great deal of ingenious conjecture has been wasted. One traveller affirms that the wedge marks of the destroyer are distinctly visible. Another, having carefully examined the fractured edges, declares that the keenest eye can detect neither wedge marks nor any other evidences of violence. We looked for none of these signs and tokens. We never asked ourselves how or when the ruin had been done. It was enough that the mighty had fallen. Inasmuch as one can clamber upon and measure these stupendous fragments, the fallen colossus is more astonishing, perhaps, as a wreck than it would have been as a whole. Here, snapped across at the waist, and flung helplessly back, lie a huge head and shoulders, to climb which is like climbing a rock. Yonder, amid piles of unintelligible debris, we see a great foot, and nearer the head, part of an enormous trunk, together with the upper halves of 2 huge thighs, clothed in the usual shenty or striped tunic. The claft or headdress is also striped, and these stripes in both instances retain the delicate yellow colour with which they were originally filled in. To judge from the way in which this colour was applied, one would say that the statue was tinted rather than painted. The surface work, wherever it remains, is as smooth and highly finished as the cutting of the finest gem. Even the ground of the superb cartouche, on the upper half of the arm, is elaborately polished. Finally, in the pit which it ploughed out in falling lies the great pedestal, hieroglyphed with the usual pompous titles of Rameses Mar Amen. Diodorus, knowing nothing of Rameses or his style, interprets the inscriptions after his own fanciful fashion. I am Ozymandias, king of kings. If any would know how great I am, and where I lie, let him excel me in any of my works. The fragments of wall and shattered pylon that yet remain standing at the Ramesseum face northwest and southwest. Hence it follows that some of the most interesting of the surface sculpture, being cut in very low relief, is so placed with regard to the light as to be actually invisible after midday. It was not till the occasion of my last visit, when I came early in the morning to make a certain sketch by a certain light, that I succeeded in distinguishing a single figure of that celebrated tableau, on the south wall of the great hall, in which the Egyptians are seen to be making use of the testudo and scaling ladder to assault a Syrian fortress. The wall sculptures of the second hall are on a bolder scale, and can be seen at any hour. Here Thoth writes the name of Rameses on the egg-shaped fruit of the persea tree, and processions of shaven priests carry on their shoulders the sacred boats of various gods. In the center of each boat is a shrine supported by winged genii or cherubim. The veils over these shrines, the rings through which the bearing poles were passed, and all the appointments and ornaments of the bearer are distinctly shown. One seems here indeed to be admitted to a glimpse of those original shrines upon which Moses, learned in the sacred lore of the Egyptians, modelled, but with little alteration, his Ark of the Covenant. Next in importance to Karnak, and second in interest to none of the Theban ruins, is the vast group of buildings known by the collective name of Medinet Habu. To attempt to describe these would be to undertake a task as hopeless as the description of Karnak. Such an attempt lies, at all events, beyond the compass of these pages, so many of which have already been given to similar subjects. For it is of temples as of mountains. No two are alike, yet all sound so much alike when described that it is scarcely possible to write about them without becoming monotonous. In the present instance, therefore, I will note only a few points of special interest, referring those who wish for fuller particulars to the elaborate account of Medinet Habu in Murray's Handbook of Egypt. In the second name of Medinet Habu, Medinet being the common Arabic for city, and Habu, Abu or Tabu, being variously spelled, there survives almost beyond doubt the ancient name of that famous city which the Greeks called Thebes. It is a name for which many derivations have been suggested, but upon which the learned are not yet agreed. The ruins of Medinet Habu consist of a smaller temple founded by Queen Hattuhepsu of the 18th dynasty, a large and magnificent temple entirely built by Rameses III of the 20th dynasty, and an extremely curious and interesting building, part palace, part fortress, which is popularly known as the Pavilion. The walls of this pavilion, the walls of the great forecourt leading to the smaller temple, and a corner of the original wall of circuit are crowned in the Egyptian style with shield-shaped battlements, precisely as the Chetan and Amorite fortresses are battlemented in the sculptured tableaux at Abu Simbel and elsewhere. From whichever side one approaches Medinet Habu, these stone shields strike the eye as a new and interesting feature. They are, moreover, as far as I know, the only specimens of Egyptian battlementing which have survived destruction. Those of the wall of circuit are of the time of Rameses V, those of the pavilion of the time of Rameses III, and the latest, which are those of the forecourt, are of the period of Roman occupation. As biographical material, the temple and pavilion at Medinet Habu and the great Harris Papyrus are to the life of Rameses III precisely what Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, and the poem of Pentar are to the life of Rameses II. Great wars, great victories, magnificent praises of the prowess of the king, pompous lists of enemies slain and captured, inventories of booty and of precious gifts offered by the victor to the gods of Egypt, in both instances cover the sculptured walls and fill the written pages. A comparison of the two masses of evidence, due allowance being made for ways of Oriental fervour of diction, shows that in Rameses III we have to do with a king as brilliant, as valorous, and as successful as Rameses II. It may be that before the time of this pharaoh certain temples were used also as royal residences. It is possible to believe this of temples such as Gurna and Abydos, the plan of which includes, besides the usual halls, side chambers, and sanctuary, a number of other apartments, the uses of which are unknown. It may also be that former kings dwelt in the houses of brick and carved woodwork, such as we see represented in the wall paintings of various tombs. It is at all events a fact that the only building which we can assume to have been a royal palace, and of which any vestiges have come down to the present day, was erected by Rameses III, namely this little pavilion at Medinet Habu. It may not have been a palace. It may have been only a fortified gate, but though the chambers are small, they are well lighted, and the plan of the whole is certainly domestic in character. It consists, as we now see it, of two lodges connected by zigzag wings with the central tower. The lodges and tower stand to each other as the 3 points of an acute angle. These structures enclose an oblong courtyard leading by a passage under the central tower to the sacred enclosure beyond. So far as its present condition enables us to judge, this building contained only 8 rooms, namely, 3 one above the other, in each of the lodges, and 2 over the gateway. These towers communicate by means of devious passages in the connecting wings. 2 of the windows in the wings are adorned with balconies supported on brackets, each bracket representing the head and shoulders of a crouching captive, in the attitude of a gargoyle. The heads and dresses of these captives, conceived as they are in a vein of Gothic barbarism, are still bright with colour. The central, or gateway tower, is substantially perfect. The writer with help got as high as the first chamber, the ceiling of which is painted in a rich and intricate pattern, as an imitation of mosaic. The top room is difficult of access, but can be reached by a good climber. Our friend F.W.S., who made his way up there a year or 2 before, found upon the walls some interesting sculptures of cups and vases, apparently part of an illustrated inventory of domestic utensils. 3 of these, unlike any engraved in the works of Wilkinson or Rossellini, are here reproduced from his sketch made upon the spot. The lid of the smaller vase, it will be observed, opens by means of a lever spooned out for the thumb to rest in, just like the lid of a German beer mug of the present day. Chapter 21. Thebes, Part 3. The external decorations of the 2 lodges are of especial interest. The lower subjects are historical. Those upon the upper stories are domestic or symbolical, and are among the most celebrated of Egyptian bas-reliefs. They have long been supposed to represent Rameses III in his harem, entertained and waited upon by female slaves. In one group the king, distinguished always by his cartouches, sits at ease in a kind of folding chair, his helmet on his head, his sandaled feet upon a footstool, as one returned and resting after battle. In his left hand he holds a round object like a fruit. With the right he chucks under the chin an ear-ringed and necklaced damsel who presents a lotus blossom at his nose. In another much mutilated subject they are represented playing a game at draughts. This famous subject, which can only be seen when the light strikes sideways, would scarcely be intelligible save for the help one derives from the cuts in Wilkinson and the plates in Rossellini. It is not that the sculptures are effaced, but that the great blocks which bore them are gone from their places, having probably been hurled down bodily upon the heads of the enemy during a certain siege of which the ruins bear evident traces. Of the lady there remains little beside one arm and the hand that holds the pawn. The table has disappeared. The king has lost his legs. It happens, however, though the table is missing, that the block next above it contains the pawns, which can still be discerned from below by the help of a glass. Rossellini mentions 3 or 4 more subjects of a similar character, including a second group of draught players, all visible in his time. The writer, however, looked for them in vain. These tableaux are supposed to illustrate the home life of Ramesses III, and to confirm the domestic character of the pavilion. Even the scarab-selling Arabs that haunt the ruins, even the donkey boys of Luxor, call it the harem of the Sultan. Modern science, however, threatens to dispel one, at least, of these pleasant fantasies. The king, it seems, under the name of Rhampsinitus, is the hero of a very ancient legend related by Herodotus. While he yet lived, runs the story, he descended into Hades, and there played a game at draughts with the goddess Demeter, from whom he won a golden napkin, in memory of which adventure and of his return to earth, the Egyptians, says Herodotus, instituted a festival which they celebrated in my day. In another version, as told by Plutarch, Isis is substituted for Demeter. Viewing these tales by the light of a certain passage of the ritual, in which the happy dead is promised power to transform himself at will, to play at draughts, to repose in a pavilion, Dr. Birch has suggested that the whole of this scene may be of a memorial character, and represent an incident in the land of shades. Below these harem groups come colossal bas-reliefs of a religious and military character. The king, as usual, smites his prisoners in presence of the gods. A slender and spirited figure in act to slay, the fiery hero strides across the wall, like Baal descended from the heights of heaven. His limbs are endued with the force of victory. With his right hand he seizes the multitudes, his left reaches like an arrow after those who fly before him. His sword is sharp as that of his father Mentu. Below these great groups run friezes sculptured with kneeling figures of vanquished chiefs, among whom are Libyan, Sicilian, Sardinian, and Etruscan leaders. Every head in these friezes is a portrait. The Libyan is beardless, his lips are thin, his nose is hooked, his forehead retreats, he wears a close-fitting cap with a pendant hanging in front of the ear. The features of the Sardinian chief are no less Asiatic. He wears the usual Sardinian helmet, surmounted by a ball and 2 spikes. The profile of the Sicilian closely resembles that of the Sardinian. He wears a headdress like the modern Persian cap. As ethnological types, these heads are extremely valuable. Colonists not long since departed from the western coast of Asia Minor, these early European settlers are seen with the Asiatic stamp of features, a stamp which now has entirely disappeared. Other European nations are depicted elsewhere in these Medinet Habu sculptures. Pelasgians from the Greek Isles, Oscans perhaps from Pompeii, Daunians from the districts between Tarentum and Brundusium, figure here each in their national costume. Of these, the Pelasgian alone resembles the modern European. On the left wall of the pavilion gateway, going up towards the temple, there is a large bas-relief of Ramesses III leading a string of captives into the presence of Amun-Ra. Among these, the sculptures being in a high state of preservation, there are a number of Pelasgians, some of whom have features of the classical Greek type, and are strikingly handsome. The Pelasgic headdress resembles our old infantry shako, and some of the men wear disc-shaped amulets pierced with a hole in the center, through which is passed the chain that suspends it round the neck. Leaving to the left a fine sitting statue of Khons in green basalt, and to the right his prostrate fellow, we pass under the gateway, cross a space of desolate crude brick mounds, and see before us the ruins of the first pylon of the great temple of Khem. Once past the threshold of this pylon, we enter upon a succession of magnificent courtyards. The hieroglyphs here are on a colossal scale, and are cut deeper than any others in Egypt. They are also coloured with a more subtle eye to effect. Struck by the unusual splendour of some of the blues, and by a peculiar look of scintillation which they assumed in certain lights, I examined them particularly, and found that the effect had been produced by very subtle shades of gradation, in what appeared at first sight to be simple flat tints. In some of the reeds, for instance, the ground colour begins at the top of the leaf in pure cobalt, and passes imperceptibly down to a tint that is almost emerald green at the bottom. The inner walls of this great courtyard, and the outer face of the north-east wall, are covered with sculptures outlined, so to say, in intaglio, and relieved in the hollow, so that the forms, though rounded, remain level with the general surface. In these tableaux the old world lives again. Rameses III, his sons and nobles, his armies, his foes, play once more the brief drama of life and death. Great battles are fought, great victories are won, the slain are counted, the captured drag their chains behind the victor's chariot, the king triumphs, is crowned, and sacrifices to the gods. Elsewhere more wars, more slaughter. There is revolt in Libya, there are raids on the Asiatic border, there are invaders coming in ships from the islands of the Great Sea. The royal standard is raised, troops assemble, arms are distributed. Again the king goes forth in his might, followed by the flower of Egyptian chivalry. His horsemen are heroes, his foot soldiers are as lions that roar in the mountains. The king himself flames like Mentu in his hour of wrath. He falls upon the foe with the swiftness of a meteor. Here, crowded in rude bullock trucks, they seek safety and flight. Yonder their galleys are sunk, their warriors are slain, drowned, captured, scathed, as it were, in a devouring fire. Never again will they sow seed or reap harvest on the fair face of the earth. Behold, says the Pharaoh, behold, I have taken their frontiers for my frontiers. I have devastated their towns, burned their crops, trampled their people under foot. Rejoice, O Egypt, exalt thy voice to the heavens, for behold, I reign over all the lands of the barbarians. I, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Rameses III. Such, linked to each by a running commentary of text, are the illustrations. The story is written elsewhere. Elaborately hieroglyphed in upwards of 70 closely packed columns, it covers the whole eastern front of the great north tower of the second propylon. This propylon divides the Osiride and Hypathral courts, so that the inscription faces those entering the temple and precedes the tableaux. Not even the poem of Pentar is more picturesque, not even the Psalms of David are more fervid, than the style of this great chronicle. The writer pitched her tent in the doorway of the first propylon, and thence sketched the northwest corner of the courtyard, including the tower with the inscription and the Osiride colossi. The accompanying illustration faithfully reproduces that sketch. The roof of the colonnade to the right is cumbered with crude brick ruins of medieval date. The hieroglyphs, sculptured along the architrave and down the sides of the pillars, are still bright with colour. The colossi are all the worse for 3,000 years of ill usage. Through the sculptured doorway opposite, one looks across the Hypathral court, and catches a glimpse of the ruined hall of pillars beyond. While the writer was at work in the shade of the first pylon, an Arab storyteller took possession of that opposite doorway, and entertained the donkey boys and sailors. Well paid with a little tobacco and a few copper piastres, he went on for hours, his shrill chant rising every now and then to a quavering scream. He was a wizened, grizzled old fellow, miserably poor and tattered, but he had the Arabian Nights and hundreds of other tales by heart. Mariette was of the opinion that the temple of Medinet Habu, erected as it is on the site of the great Theban necropolis, is, like the Ramesseum, a funerary monument erected by Rameses III in his own lifetime to his own memory. These battered colossi represent the king in the character of Osiris, and are in fact on a huge scale precisely what the ordinary funerary statuettes are upon a small scale. They would be out of place in any but a monumental edifice, and they alone suffice to determine the character of the building. And such, no doubt, was the character of the Amenopheum, of the little temple called Deir el Medinet, of the temple of Queen Hatshepsut, known as Deir el Bahari, of the temple of Gurna, of almost every important structure erected upon this side of the river. Of the Amenopheum there remain only a few sculptured blocks, a few confused foundations, and, last representatives of an avenue of statues of various sizes, the famous colossi of the plain. The temple of Deir el Bahari, built in terraces up the mountainside, and approached once upon a time by a magnificent avenue of sphinxes, the course of which is yet visible, would probably be, if less ruined, the most interesting temple on the western side of the river. The monumental intention of this building is shown by its dedication to Hathor, the Lady of Amenti, and by the fact that the tomb of Queen Hatshepsut was identified by Rhind some 25 years ago as one of the excavated sepulchres in the cliffside, close to where the temple ends by abutting against the rock. As for the temple of Gurna, it is, at least in part, as distinctly a memorial edifice as the Medici chapel at Florence, or the Superga at Turin. It was begun by Seti I in memory of his father Ramesses I, the founder of the 19th dynasty. Seti, however, died before the work was completed. Hereupon Ramesses II, his son and successor, extended the general plan, finished the part dedicated to his grandfather, and added sculptures to the memory of Seti I. Later still, Meneptah, the son and successor of Ramesses II, left his cartouches upon one of the doorways. The whole building, in short, is a family monument, and contains a family portrait gallery. Here all the personages whose names figure in the shrines of the Ramessides at Silsilis are depicted in their proper persons. In one tableau, Ramesses I, defunct, deified, swathed, enshrined, and crowned like Osiris, is worshipped by Seti I. Behind Seti stands his queen Tua, the mother of Ramesses II. Elsewhere, Seti I, being now dead, is deified and worshipped by Ramesses II, who pours a libation to his father's statue. Through all these handsome heads there runs a striking family likeness. All more or less partake of that Dantesque type which characterizes the portraits of Ramesses II in his youth. The features of Ramesses I and Seti I are somewhat pinched and stern, like the Dante of elder days. The delicate profile of Queen Tua, which is curiously like some portraits of Queen Elizabeth, is perhaps too angular to be altogether pleasing. But in the well-known face of Ramesses II, these harsher details vanish and the beauty of the race culminates. The artists of Egyptian Renaissance, always great in profile portraiture, are nowhere seen to better advantage than in this interesting series. Adjoining what may be called the monumental part of the building, we find a number of halls and chambers, the uses of which are unknown. Most writers assume that they were the private apartments of the king. Some go so far as to give the name of temple palaces to all these great funerary structures. It is, however, far more probable that these western temples were erected in conjunction, though not in direct communication, with the royal tombs in the adjacent valley of Bab el-Malek. Now every Egyptian tomb of importance has its outer chamber or votive oratory, the walls of which are covered with paintings descriptive, in some instances, of the occupations of the deceased upon earth, and in others of the adventures of his soul after death. Here at stated seasons the survivors repaired with offerings. No priest, it would seem, of necessity officiated at these little services. A whole family would come, bringing the first fruits of their garden, the best of their poultry, cakes of homemade bread, bouquets of lotus blossoms. With their own hands they piled the altar, and the eldest son, as representative of the rest, burned the incense and poured the libations. It is a scene constantly reproduced upon monuments of every epoch. These votive oratories, however, are wholly absent in the valley of Bab el-Malek. The royal tombs consist of only tunnelled passages and sepulchral vaults, the entrances to which were closed forever as soon as the sarcophagus was occupied. Hence it may be concluded that each memorial temple played to the tomb of its tutelary saint and sovereign that part which is played by the external oratory attached to the tomb of a private individual. Nor must it be forgotten that as early as the time of the Pyramid Kings there was a votive chapel attached to every pyramid, the remains of which are traceable in almost every instance, on the east side. There were also priests of the pyramids, as we learn from innumerable funerary inscriptions. An oratory on so grand a scale would imply an elaborate ceremonial. A dead and deified king would doubtless have his train of priests, his daily liturgies, his processions and sacrifices. All this again implies additional accommodation, and accounts, I venture to think, for any number of extra halls and chambers. Such sculptures as yet remain on the walls of these ruined apartments are, in fact, wholly funereal and sacrificial in character. It is also to be remembered that we have here a temple dedicated to two kings, and served most likely by a twofold college of priests. The wall sculptures at Gurna are extremely beautiful, especially those erected by Seti I. Where it has been accidentally preserved, the surface is as smooth, the execution as brilliant, as the finest medieval ivory carving. Behind a broken column, for instance, that leans against the south wall west of the sanctuary, one may see, by peeping this way and that, the ram's head prow of a sacred boat, quite unharmed and of surpassing delicacy. The modelling of the ram's head is simply faultless. It would indeed be scarcely too much to say that this one fragment, if all the rest had perished, would alone place the decorative sculpture of ancient Egypt in a rank second only to that of Greece. The Temple of Gurna, northernmost of the Theban group, stands at the mouth of that famous valley called by the Arabs Bab el-Mulek, and by travellers the Valley of the Tombs of the Kings. This valley may be described as a bifurcated ravine, ending in two cul-de-sacs and hemmed in on all sides by limestone precipices. It winds round behind the cliffs which face Luxor and Karnak, and runs almost parallel with the Nile. This range of cliffs is perforated on both sides with tombs. The priests and nobles of many dynasties were buried terrace above terrace on the side next the river. Back to back with them, in the silent and secret valley beyond, slept the kings in their everlasting sepulchres. Chapter 21. Thebes, Part 4. Most travellers moor for a day or two at Karnak, and thence make their excursion to Bab el-Mulek. By doing so they lose one of the most interesting rides in the neighbourhood of Thebes. El and the writer started from Luxor one morning about an hour after daybreak, crossing the river at the usual point, and thence riding northwards along the bank, with the Nile on the one hand and the cornlands on the other. In the course of such rides one discovers the almost incredible fertility of the Thebaid. Every inch of arable ground is turned to account. All that grows, grows lustily. The barley ripples in one uninterrupted sweep from Medinet Habu to a point halfway between the Ramesseum and Gurna. Next come plantations of tobacco, cotton, hemp, linseed, maize, and lentils, so closely set, so rich in promise, that the country looks as if it were laid out in allotment grounds for miles together. Where the rice crop has been gathered, clusters of temporary huts have sprung up in the clearings, for the fellaheen come out from their crowded villages in the sweet of the year, and live in the midst of the crops which they now guard, and which presently they will reap. The walls of these summer huts are mere wattled fences of Indian corn straw, with bundles of the same laid lightly across the top by way of roofing. This pastoral world is everywhere up and doing. Here are men plying the shadoof by the river's brink, women spinning in the sun, children playing, dogs barking, larks soaring and singing overhead. Against the foot of the cliffs yonder, where the vegetation ends and the tombs begin, there flows a calm river edged with palms. A few months ago we should have been deceived by that fairy water. We know now that it is the mirage. Striking off by and by towards the left, we make for a point where the mountains recede and run low, and a wedge-like spit of sandy desert encroaches upon the plain. On the verge of this spit stands a clump of sycamores and palms. A row of old, yellow columns supporting a sculptured architrave gleams through the boughs. A little village nestles close by, and on the desert slope beyond, in the midst of a desolate Arab burial ground, we see a tiny mosque with one small cupola dazzling white in the sunshine. This is Gourna. There is a spring here, and some girls are drawing water from the well near the temple. Our donkeys slake their thirst from the cattle trough, a broken sarcophagus that may once have held the mummy of a king. A creaking sakia is at work yonder, turned by a couple of red cows with mild Hathor-like faces. The old man who drives them sits in the middle of the cogwheel and goes slowly round as if he was being roasted. We now leave behind us the well and the trees and the old Greek-looking temple and turn our faces westward, bound for an opening yonder among cliffs pitted with the mouths of empty tombs. It is plain to see that we are now entering upon what was once a torrent bed. Rushing down from the hills, the pent-up waters have here spread fan-like over the slope of the desert, strewing the ground with boulders, and ploughing it into hundreds of tortuous channels. Up that torrent bed lies our road today. The weird rocks stand like sentinels to right and left as one enters the mouth of the valley, and take strange shapes as of obelisks and sphinxes. Some, worn at the base and towering like ruined pyramids above, remind us of tombs on the Appian Way. As the ravine narrows, the limestone walls rise higher. The chalky track glares underfoot. Piles of shivered chips sparkle and scintillate at the foot of the rocks. The cliffs burn at a white heat. The atmosphere palpitates like gaseous vapor. The sun blazes overhead. Not a breath stirs, neither is there a finger's breadth of shade on either side. It is like riding into the mouth of a furnace. Meanwhile, one looks in vain for any sign of life. No blade of green has grown here since the world began. No breathing creature makes these rocks its home. All is desolation, such desolation as one dreams of in a world scathed by fire from heaven. When we have gone a long way, always tracking up the bed of the torrent, we came to a place where our donkeys turn off from the main course, and make for what is evidently a forced passage cut clean through a wall of solid limestone. The place was once a mere recess in the cliffs, but on the farther side, masked by a natural barrier of rock, there lay another valley leading to a secluded amphitheatre among the mountains. The first Pharaoh who chose his place of burial among those hidden ways must have been he who cut the pass and levelled the road by which we now travel. This cutting is Bab el Moloch, the Gate of the King, a name which doubtless perpetuates that by which the place was known to the old Egyptians. Once through the gate, a grand mountain rises into view. Egypt is the land of strange mountains, and here is one which reproduces on a giant scale every feature of the pyramid of Onuphis at Saqqara. It is square, it rises stage above stage in ranges of columnar cliffs, with slopes of debris between, and it terminates in a blunt four-sided peak nearly 1,800 feet above the level of the plain. Keeping this mountain always before us, we now follow the windings of the second valley, which is even more narrow, parched, and glaring than the first. Perhaps the intense heat makes the road appear longer than it really is, but it seems to us like several miles. At length the uniformity of the way is broken. Two small ravines branch off, one to the right, one to the left, and in both, at the foot of the rocks, there are here and there to be seen square openings, like cellar doors, half sunk below the surface, and seeming to shoot downwards into the bowels of the earth. In another moment or so, our road ends suddenly in a wild, tumbled waste, like an exhausted quarry, shut in all round by impending precipices, at the base of which more rock-cut portals peep out at different points. From the moment when it first came into sight, I had made certain that in that pyramidal mountain we should find the tombs of the kings. So certain that I can scarcely believe our guide when he assures us that these cellars are the places we have come to see, and that the mountain contains not a single tomb. We alight, however, climb a steep slope, and find ourselves on the threshold of number 17. Belzoni tomb, says our guide, and Belzoni's tomb, as we know, is the tomb of Seti I. I am almost ashamed to remember now that we took our luncheon in the shade of that solemn vestibule, and rested and made merry before going down into the great gloomy sepulchre, whose staircases and corridors plunged away into the darkness below, as if they led straight to the land of Amenti. The tombs in the valley of Bab el Malik are as unlike the tombs in the cliffs opposite Luxor as if the Theban kings and the Theban nobles were of different races and creeds. Those sacred scribes and dignitaries, with their wives and families, and their numerous friends and dependents, were a joyous set. They loved the things of this life, and would fain have carried their pursuits and pleasures with them into the land beyond the grave. So they decorated the walls of their tombs with pictures of the way in which their lives were spent, and hoped perhaps that the mummy, dreaming away its long term of solitary waiting, might take comfort in those shadowy reminiscences. The kings, on the contrary, covered every foot of their last palaces with scenes from the life to come. The wanderings of the soul after its separation from the body, the terrors and dangers that beset it during its journey through Hades, the demons it must fight, the accusers to whom it must answer, the transformations it must undergo, afforded subjects for endless illustration. Of the fishing and fowling and feasting and junketing that we saw the other day in those terraces behind the Ramesseum, we discover no trace in the tombs of Bab el Malik. In place of singing and lute-playing, we find here prayers and invocations. For the pleasant Nile boat, and the water parties, and the chase of the gazelle and the ibex, we now have the bark of Charon, and the basin of purgatorial fire, and the strife with the infernal deities. The contrast is sharp and strange. It is as if an Epicurean aristocracy had been ruled by a line of Puritan kings. The tombs of the subjects are anacreonics. The tombs of their sovereigns are as penitential psalms. To go down into one of these great sepulchres is to descend one's self into the lower world, and to tread the path of the shades. Crossing the threshold, we look up, half expecting to read those terrible words in which all who enter are warned to leave hope behind them. The passage slopes before our feet, the daylight fades behind us. At the end of the passage comes a flight of steps, and from the bottom of that flight of steps we see another corridor slanting down into the depths of utter darkness. The walls on both sides are covered with close-cut columns of hieroglyphic text, interspersed with ominous shapes, half deity, half demon. Huge serpents writhe beside us along the walls. Guardian spirits of threatening aspect advance, brandishing swords of flame. A strange heaven opens overhead, a heaven where the stars travel in boats across the seas of space, and the sun, escorted by the hours, the months, and the signs of the zodiac, issues from the east, sets in the west, and traverses the hemisphere of everlasting night. We go on, and the last gleam of daylight vanishes in the distance. Another flight of steps leads now to a succession of passages and halls, some smaller, some larger, some vaulted, some supported on pillars. Here yawns a great pit half full of debris. Yonder opens a suite of unfinished chambers abandoned by the workmen. The farther we go, the more weird become our surroundings. The walls swarm with ugly and evil things. Serpents and bats and crocodiles, some with human heads and legs, some vomiting fire, some armed with spears and darts, pursue and torture the wicked. These unfortunates have their hearts torn out, are boiled in cauldrons, are suspended head downwards over seas of flame, are speared, decapitated, and driven in headless gangs to scenes of further torment. Beheld by the dim and shifting light of a few candles, these painted horrors assume an aspect of ghastly reality. They start into life as we pass, then drop behind us into darkness. That darkness alone is awful. The atmosphere is suffocating. The place is ghostly and peopled with nightmares. Elsewhere we come upon scenes less painful. The sun emerges from the lower hemisphere. The justified dead sow and reap in the Elysian fields, gather celestial fruits, and bathe in the waters of truth. The royal mummy reposes in its shrine. funerary statues of the king are worshipped with incense and offerings of meat and libations of wine. Finally, the king arrives, purified and justified, at the last stage of his spiritual journey. He is welcomed by the gods, ushered into the presence of Osiris, and received into the abode of the blessed. Coming out for a moment into blinding daylight, we drink a long draught of pure air, cross a few yards of uneven ground, arrive at the mouth of another excavation, and plunge again into the underground darkness. A third and fourth time we repeat this strange experience. It is like a feverish sleep troubled by gruesome dreams and broken by momentary wakings. These tombs in a general way are very much alike. Some are longer than others, some loftier. In some the descent is gradual, in others it is steep and sudden. Certain leading features are common to all. The great serpent, the scarab, the bat, the crocodile are always conspicuous on the walls. The judgment scene and the well-known typical picture of the four races of mankind are continually reproduced. Some tombs, however, vary both in plan and decoration. That of Ramesses III, though not nearly so beautiful as the tomb of Seti I, is perhaps the most curious of all. The paintings here are, for the most part, designed on an unsculptured surface coated with white stucco. The drawing is often indifferent, and the coloring is uniformly coarse and gaudy. Yellows abound, and crude reds and blues remind us of the colored picture books of our childhood. It is difficult to understand, indeed, how the builder of Medinet Habu, with the best Egyptian art of the day at his command, should have been content with such wall paintings as these. Still, Ramesses III seems to have had a grand idea of going in state to the next world with his retainers around him. In a series of small antechambers opening off from the first corridor, we see depicted all the household furniture, all the plate, the weapons, the wealth and treasure of the king. Upon the walls of one, the cooks and bakers are seen preparing the royal dinner. In the others are depicted magnificent thrones, gilded galleys with party-colored sails, gold and silver vases, rich store of arms and armor, piles of precious woods, of panther skins, of fruits and birds, and curious baskets, and all such articles of personal luxury as a palace-building pharaoh might delight in. Here also are the two famous harpers, cruelly defaced, but still sweeping the strings with the old powerful touch that erewhile soothed the king in his hours of melancholy. These two spirited figures, which are undoubtedly portraits, almost redeem the poverty of the rest of the paintings. In many tombs the empty sarcophagus yet occupies its ancient place. We saw one in number 2, Ramesses IV, and another in number 9, Ramesses VI. The first, a grand monolith of dark granite, overturned and but little injured; the second, shattered by early treasure-seekers. Most of the tombs at Bab el-Muluk were open in Ptolemaic times. Being then, as now, among the stock sights and wonders of Thebes, they were visited by crowds of early travellers, who have, as usual, left their neatly scribbled graffiti on the walls. When and by whom the sepulchres were originally violated is of course unknown. Some doubtless were sacked by the Persians, others were plundered by the Egyptians themselves, long enough before Cambyses. Not even in the days of the Ramessides, though a special service of guards was told off for duty in the Great Valley, were the kings safe in their tombs. During the reign of Ramesses IX, whose tomb is here and known as number 6, there seems to have been an organized band, not only of robbers but of receivers, who lived by depredations of the kind. A contemporary papyrus tells how in one instance the royal mummies were found lying in the dust, their gold and silver ornaments and the treasures of their tombs all stolen. In another instance a king and his queen were carried away bodily, to be unrolled and rifled at leisure. This curious information is all recorded in the form of a report, drawn up by the commandant of western Thebes, who, with certain other officers and magistrates, officially inspected the tombs of the royal ancestors during the reign of Ramesses IX. No royal tomb has been found absolutely intact in the valley of Bab el-Muluk. Even that of Seti I had been secretly entered ages before Belzoni discovered it. He found in it statues of wood and porcelain, and the mummy of a bull, but nothing of value save the sarcophagus, which was empty. There can be no doubt that the priesthood were largely implicated in these contemporary sacrileges. Of 39 persons accused by name in the papyrus just quoted, 7 are priests, and 8 are sacred scribes. Chapter 21. Thebes, Part 5. To rob the dead was always a lucrative trade at Thebes, and we may be certain that the splendid pharaohs who slept in the valley of the tombs of the kings went to their dark palaces magnificently equipped for the life to come. When, indeed, one thinks of the jewels, furniture, vases, ointments, clothing, arms, and precious documents, which were as certainly buried in those tombs as the royal mummies for whom they were excavated, it seems far more wonderful that the parure of one queen should have escaped, rather than that all the rest of these dead and gone royalties should have fallen among thieves. Of all the tombs in the valley of Bab el Malik, one would rather, I think, have discovered that of Rameses III. As he was one of the richest of the pharaohs, and an undoubted virtuoso in his tastes, so we may be sure that his tomb was furnished with all kinds of beautiful and precious things. What would we not give now to find some of those elaborate gold and silver vases, those cushioned thrones and sofas, those bows and quivers and shirts of mail so carefully catalogued on the walls of the side chambers in the first corridor? I do not doubt that specimens of all these things were buried with the king and left ready for his use. He died believing that his Ka would enjoy and make use of these treasures, and that his soul would come back after long cycles of probation and make its home once more in the mummied body. He thought he should rise as from sleep, cast off his bandages, eat and be refreshed, and put on sandals and scented vestments, and take his staff in his hand, and go forth again into the light of everlasting day. Poor ghost, wandering bodiless through space! Where now are thy funeral baked meats, thy changes of raiment, thy perfumes and precious ointments? Where is that body for which thou wert once so solicitous, and without which resurrection is impossible? One fancies thee sighing forlorn through these desolate halls when all is silent and the moon shines down the valley. Life at Thebes is made up of incongruities. A morning among temples is followed by an afternoon of antiquity hunting, and a day of meditation among tombs winds up with a dinner party on board some friend's dahabeah, or a fantasia at the British consulate. Elle and the writer did their fair share of antiquity hunting both at Luxor and elsewhere, but chiefly at Luxor. I may say indeed that our life here was one long pursuit of the pleasures of the chase. The game, it is true, was prohibited, but we enjoyed it none the less because it was illegal. Perhaps we enjoyed it the more. There were whispers about this time of a tomb that had been discovered on the western side, a wonderful tomb, rich in all kinds of treasure. No one, of course, had seen these things. No one knew who had found them. No one knew where they were hidden. But there was a solemn secrecy about certain of the Arabs, and a conscious look about some of the visitors, and an air of awakened vigilance about the government officials, which savoured of mystery. These rumours by and by assumed more definite proportions. Dark hints were dropped of a possible papyrus, the M.B.'s babbled of mummies, and an American dahabeah lying innocently off Karnak was reported to have a mummy on board. Now neither Elle nor the writer desired to become the happy proprietor of an ancient Egyptian, but the papyrus was a thing to be thought of. In a fatal hour we expressed a wish to see it. From that moment every mummy-snatcher in the place regarded us as his lawful prey. Beguiled into one den after another, we were shown all the stolen goods in Thebes. Some of the things were very curious and interesting. In one house we were offered 2 bronze vases, each with a band of delicately engraved hieroglyphs running round the lip. Also a square stand of basket-work in 2 colours, precisely like that engraved in Sir G. Wilkinson's first volume, after the original in the Berlin Museum. Pieces of mummy case and a wall sculpture and sepulchre tablets abounded, and on one occasion we were introduced into the presence of a mummy. All these houses were tombs, and in this one the mummy was stowed away in a kind of recess at the end of a long rock-cut passage, probably the very place once occupied by the original tenant. It was a mummy of the same period as that which we saw disentombed under the auspices of the governor, and was enclosed in the same kind of cartonnage, patterned in many colours on a white ground. I shall never forget that curious scene, the dark and dusty vault, the Arabs with their lanterns, the mummy in its gaudy cerements lying on an old mat at our feet. Meanwhile we tried in vain to get sight of the coveted papyrus. A grave Arab dropped in once or twice after nightfall, and talked it over vaguely with the dragoman, but never came to the point. He offered it first with a mummy for £100. Finding, however, that we would neither buy his papyrus unseen nor his mummy at any price, he haggled and hesitated for a day or two, evidently trying to play us off against some rival or rivals unknown, and finally disappeared. These rivals, we afterwards found out, were the M.B.'s. They bought both mummy and papyrus at an enormous price, and then, unable to endure the perfume of their ancient Egyptian, drowned the dear departed at the end of a week. Other purchasers were possibly less sensitive. We heard, at all events, of 15 mummies successfully insinuated through the Alexandrian custom house by a single agent that winter. There is, in fact, a growing passion for mummies among Nile travellers. Unfortunately, the prices rise with the demand, and although the mine is practically inexhaustible, a mummy nowadays becomes not only a prohibited but a costly luxury. At Luxor the British, American, and French consuls are Arabs. The Prussian consul is a Copt. The Austrian consul is, or was, an American. The French consul showed us over the old tumble-down building called the French House, which, though but a rude structure of palm timbers and sun-dried clay, built partly against and partly over the Temple of Luxor, has its place in history. For there, in 1829, Champollion and Rossellini lived and worked together, during part of their long sojourn at Thebes. Rossellini tells how they used to sit up at night, dividing the fruits of the day's labour, Champollion copying whatever might be useful for his Egyptian grammar, and Rossellini the new words that furnished materials for his dictionary. There, too, lodged the naval officers sent out by the French in 1831 to remove the obelisk which now stands in the Place de la Concorde. And there, writing those charming letters that delight the world, Lady Duff Gordon lingered through the last few winters of her life. The rooms in which she first lived, and the balcony in which she took such pleasure, were no longer accessible, owing to the ruinous state of one of the staircases, but we saw the rooms she last inhabited. Her couch, her rug, her folding chair, were there still. The walls were furnished with a few cheap prints and a pair of tin sconces. All was very bare and comfortless. We asked if it was just like this when the Sitta lived here. The Arab consul replied that she had a table and some books. He looked himself in the last stage of consumption, and spoke and moved like one that had done with life. We were shocked at the dreariness of the place till we went to the window. That window, which commanded the Nile and the western plain of Thebes, furnished the room and made its poverty splendid. The sun was near setting. We could distinguish the mounds and the pylons of Medinet Habu and the site of the Ramesseum. The terraced cliffs, overtopped by the pyramidal mountain of Bab el Malik, burned crimson against a sky of stainless blue. The footpath leading to the valley of the tombs of the kings showed like a hot white scar winding along the face of the rocks. The river gave back the sapphire tones of the sky. I thought I could be well content to spend many a winter in no matter how comfortless a lodging, if I only had that wonderful view, with its infinite beauty of light and colour and space, and its history and its mystery always before my windows. Another historical house is that built by Sir G. Wilkinson among the tombs of Sheikh Abd el-Qurna. Here he lived while amassing the materials for his manners and customs of the ancient Egyptians, and here Lepsius and his company of artists put up while at work on the western bank. Science makes little impression on the native mind. No one now remembers Champollion or Rossellini or Sir G. Wilkinson, but every Arab in Luxor cherishes the memory of Lady Duff Gordon in his heart of hearts, and speaks of her with blessings. The French house was built over the roof of the sanctuary at the southern end of the temple. At the northern end, built up between the enormous sandstone columns of the great colonnade, was the house of Mustapha Aga, most hospitable and kindly of British consuls. Mustapha Aga had travelled in Europe, and spoke fluent Italian, English, and French. His eldest son was governor of Luxor; his younger, the little Ahmed whom Lady Duff Gordon delighted to educate, having spent 2 years in England as the guest of Lord D., had become an accomplished Englishman. In the round of gaiety that goes on at Luxor the British consulate played the leading part. Mustapha Aga entertained all the English dahabiyas, and all the English dahabiyas entertained Mustapha Aga. We were invited to several fantasias at the consulate, and dined with Mustapha Aga at his suburban house the evening before we left Luxor. The appointed hour was 8:30 p.m. We arrived amid much barking of dogs, and were received by our host in a large empty hall surrounded by a divan. Here we remained till dinner was announced. We were next ushered through an anteroom where 2 turbaned and barefooted servants were in waiting, the one with a brass basin and ewer, the other with an armful of Turkish towels. We then, each in turn, held our hands over the basin, had water poured on them, and received a towel apiece. These towels we were told to keep, and they served for dinner napkins. The anteroom opened into a brilliantly lighted dining room of moderate size, having in the centre a round brass table with an upright fluted rim, like a big tray. For each person were placed a chair, a huge block of bread, a wooden spoon, 2 tumblers, and a bouquet. Plates, knives, forks, there were none. The party consisted of the happy couple, the director of the Luxor Telegraph Office, L., the writer, Ahmed, and our host. "Tonight we are all Arabs," said Mustapha Aga, as he showed us where to sit. "We drink Nile water, and we eat with our fingers." So we drank Nile water, and for the first time in our lives we ate with our fingers. In fact, we found them exceedingly useful. The dinner was excellent. Without disrespect to our own accomplished chef, or to the accomplished chefs of our various friends upon the river, I am bound to say that it was the very best dinner I ever ate out of Europe. Everything was hot, quickly served, admirably dressed, and the best of its kind. Here is the menu. Menu, March 31st, 1874. White soup, turkey. Fish, fried samnak. Entrees, stewed pigeons, spinach and rice. Roast, dal. Entrees, kebabs of mutton, kebabs of lamb's kidneys, tomatoes with rice. Roast. Turkey with cucumber sauce. Entree, pilaf of rice. Second course. Mishmish, rus, bleben, kunafa, totla. These dishes were placed one at a time in the middle of the table, and rapidly changed. Each dipped his own spoon in the soup, dived into the stew, and pulled off pieces of fish or lamb with his fingers. Having no plates, we made plates of our bread. Meanwhile, Mustapha Aga, like an attentive host, tore off an especially choice morsel now and then, and handed it to one or another of his guests. To eat gracefully with one's fingers is a fine art. To carve with them skilfully is a science. None of us, I think, will soon forget the wonderful way in which our host attacked and vanquished the turkey, a solid colossus weighing 20 pounds, and roasted to perfection. Half rising, he turned back his cuff, poised his wrist, and driving his forefinger and thumb deep into the breast, brought out a long, stringy, smoking fragment, which he deposited on the plate of the writer. Thus begun, the turkey went round the table amid peals of laughter, and was punished by each in turn. The pilaf which followed is always the last dish served at an Egyptian or Turkish dinner. After this, our spoons were changed, and the sweets were put upon the table. The drinks throughout were plain water, rice water, and lemonade. Some native musicians played in the anteroom during dinner, and when we rose from the table we washed our hands, as before. We now returned to the large hall, and not being accomplished in the art and mystery of sitting cross-legged, curled ourselves up on the divans as best we could. The writer was conducted by Mustapha Aga to the corner seat at the upper end of the room, where he said the Princess of Wales had sat when their Royal Highnesses dined with him the year before. We were then served with pipes and coffee. The gentlemen smoked chibouks and cigarettes, while for us there were gorgeous rose-water nargilehs with long, flexible tubes and amber mouthpieces. L. had the Princess's pipe, and smoked it very cleverly all the evening. By and by came the Governor, the Cadi of Luxor, the Prussian Consul and his son, and some 3 or 4 grave-looking merchants in rich silk robes and ample turbans. Meanwhile the band, 2 fiddles, a tambourine, a ndarabuka, played at intervals at the lower end of the hall, pipes, coffee, and lemonade went continually around, and the entertainment wound up, as native entertainments always do wind up at Luxor, with a performance of Gawazi. Chapter 21. Thebes, Part 6. We had already seen these dancers at 2 previous fantasias, and we admired them no more the 3rd time than the first. They wore baggy Turkish trousers, loose gowns of gaudy pattern, and a profusion of jewellery. The première danseuse was a fine woman and rather handsome, but in the belle of the company, a thick-lipped Nubian, we could discover no charm whatever. The performances of the Gawazi, which are very ungraceful and almost wholly pantomimic, have been too often described to need description here. Only once indeed did we see them perform an actual dance, and then they swam lightly to and fro, clattering their castanets, crossing and recrossing, and bounding every now and then down the whole length of the room. This dance, we were told, was of unknown antiquity. They sang occasionally, but their voices were harsh and their melodies inharmonious. There was present, however, one native performer whom we had already heard many times, and of whose skill we never tired. This was the leader of the little band, an old man who played the kemenga, or coconut fiddle. A more unpromising instrument than the kemenga it would be difficult to conceive, yet our old Arab contrived to make it discourse most eloquent music. His solos consisted of plaintive airs and extemporized variations, embroidered with difficult, and sometimes extravagant, cadenzas. He always began sedately, but warmed to his work as he went on, seeming at last to forget everything but his own delight in his own music. At such times one could see that he was weaving some romance in his thoughts, and translating it into sounds. As the strings throbbed under his fingers, the whole man became inspired, and more than once when, in shower after shower of keen, despairing notes, he had described the wildest anguish of passion, I have observed his colour change and his hand tremble. Although we heard him repeatedly, and engaged him more than once when we had friends to dinner, I am sorry to say that I forget the name of this really great artist. He is, however, celebrated throughout the Thebaid, and is constantly summoned to Erment, Esna, Kenna, Gerga, and other large towns, to perform at private entertainments. While at Luxor, we went one Sunday morning to the Coptic church, a large building at the northern extremity of the village. Church, schools, and bishop's house are here grouped under one roof and enclosed in a courtyard, for Luxor is the centre of one of the 12 seas into which Coptic Egypt is divided. The church, which has been rebuilt of late years, is constructed of sun-dried brick, having a small apse towards the east, and at the lower or western end a screened atrium for the women. The centre aisle is perhaps 30 feet in width, the side aisles, if aisles they can be called, being thickly planted with stone pillars supporting round arches. These pillars came from Karnak, and were the gift of the Khedive. They have lotus-bud capitals, and measure about 15 feet high in the shaft. At the upper end of the nave, some 18 or 20 feet in advance of the apse, there stands a very beautiful screen inlaid in the old Coptic style with cedar, ebony, rosewood, ivory, and mother-of-pearl. This screen is the pride of the church. Through the opening in the centre one looks straight into a little wagon-roofed apse, which contains a small table and a suspended lamp, and is as dark as the sanctuary of an Egyptian temple. The reading desk, like a rickety office stool, faces the congregation, and just inside the screen stands the bishop's chair. Upon this plan, which closely resembles the plan of the first cathedral of St. Peter at Rome, most Coptic churches are built. They vary chiefly in the number of apses, some having as many as 5. The atrium generally contains a large tank, called the Epiphany tank, into which, in memory of the baptism of our Lord, the men plunge at their festival of Elgitas. Young Todros, the son of the Prussian consul, conducted us to the church. We went in at about 11 o'clock and witnessed the end of the service, which had then been going on since daybreak. The atrium was crowded with women and children, and the side aisles with men of the poorer sort. A few groups of better-dressed Copts were gathered near the screen listening to a black-robed deacon, who stood reading at the reading desk with a lighted taper in his left hand. A priest in a white vestment embroidered on the breast and hood with a red Maltese cross was squatting on his heels at the entrance to the adytum. The bishop, all in black with a black turban, sat with his back to the congregation. Every face was turned upon us when we came in. The reader paused. The white-robed priest got up. Even the bishop looked round. Presently a couple of acolytes, each carrying 2 cane-bottomed chairs, came bustling down the nave, and, unceremoniously driving away all were standing near, placed us in a row across the middle of the church. This interruption over, the reading resumed. We now observed with some surprise that every word of the lessons as they were read in Coptic was translated viva voce into Arabic by a youth in a surplice who stood against the screen facing the congregation. He had no book, but went on fluently enough, following close upon the voice of the reader. This, we were told, was done only during the reading of the lessons, the Gospel, and the Lord's Prayer. The rest of the service is performed without translation, and the Coptic, being a dead language, is consequently unintelligible to the people. When the reading of the Gospel was over, the deacon retired. The priest then came forward and made a sign to the school children, who ran up noisily from all parts of the church and joined with the choristers in a wild kind of chant. It seemed to us that this chant concluded the first part of the service. The second part closely resembled the celebration of Mass. The priest came to the door of the screen, looked at the congregation, folded his hands palm to palm, went up to the threshold of the apse, and began reciting what sounded like a litany. He then uncovered the sacred vessels, which till now had been concealed under 2 blue cotton handkerchiefs, and turning, shook the handkerchiefs towards the people. He then consecrated the wine and wafer, elevated the host, and himself partook of the Eucharist in both elements. A little bell was rung during the consecration and again at the elevation. The people, meanwhile, stood very reverently, with their heads bent, but no one knelt during any part of the service. After this, the officiating priest washed his hands in a brass basin, and the deacon, who was also the schoolmaster, came round the church holding up his scarf, which was heaped full of little cakes of unleavened bread. These he distributed to all present. An acolyte followed with a plate, and collected the offerings of the congregation. We now thought the service was over, but there remained 4 wee, crumpled, brown mites of babies to be christened. These small Copts were carried up the church by 4 acolytes, followed by 4 anxious fathers. The priest then muttered a short prayer, crossed the babies with water from the basin in which he had washed his hands, drank the water, wiped the basin out with a piece of bread, ate the bread, and dismissed the newly made Christians with a hasty blessing. Finally, the bishop, who had taken no part in the service, nor even partaken of the Eucharist, came down from his chair and stood before the altar to bless the congregation. Hereupon all the men and boys ranged themselves in single file and trooped through between the screen and the apse, crowding in at one side and out at the other, each being touched by the bishop on his cheek as he went by. If they lagged, the bishop clapped his hands impatiently, and the schoolmaster drove them through faster. When there were no more to come, the women and little girls, be it observed, coming in for no share of this benediction, the priest took off his vestments and laid them in a heap upon the altar. The deacon distributed a basketful of blessed cakes among the poor of the congregation, and the bishop walked down the nave, eating a cake and giving a bit here and there to the best-dressed Copts as he went along. So ended this interesting and curious service, which I have described thus minutely for the reason that it represents, with probably but little change, the earliest ceremonial of Christian worship in Egypt. Before leaving, we asked permission to look at the books from which the service had been read. They were all very old and dilapidated. The New Testament, however, was in better condition than the rest, and was beautifully written upon vellum, in red and black ink. The Coptic, of course, looks like Greek to the eyes of the uninitiated, but some of the illuminated capitals struck us as bearing a marked resemblance to certain of the more familiar hieroglyphic characters. While we were examining the books, the bishop sent his servant to invite us to pay him a visit. We accordingly followed the man up an outer flight of wooden steps at one corner of the courtyard, and were shown into a large room built partly over the church. Here we found the bishop, handsome, plump, dignified, with soft brown eyes and a slightly grizzled beard, seated cross-legged on a divan, and smoking his chibouk. On a table in the middle of the room stood 2 or 3 blue and white bottles of oriental porcelain. The windows, which were sashless and very large, looked over to Karnak. The sparrows flew in and out as they listed. The bishop received us very amiably, and the proceedings opened as usual with pipes and coffee. The conversation which followed consisted chiefly of questions on our part and of answers on his. We asked the extent of his diocese, and learned that it reached from Aswan on the south to Kenna on the north. The revenue of the sea, he said, was wholly derived from endowments in land. He estimated the number of Copts in Luxor at 2,000, being 2/3 of the entire population. The church was built and decorated in the time of his predecessor. He had himself been bishop here for rather more than 4 years. We then spoke of the service we had just witnessed, and of the books we had seen. I showed him my prayer book, which he examined with much curiosity. I explained the differences indicated by the black and the rubricated matter, and pointed out the parts that were sung. He was, however, more interested in the outside than in the contents, and tapped the binding once or twice to see if it were leather or wood. As for the gilt corners and clasp, he undoubtedly took them for solid gold. The conversation next turned upon Coptic, the idle man asking him if he believed it to be the tongue actually spoken by the ancient Egyptians. To this he replied, "Yes, undoubtedly. What else should it be?" The idle man hereupon suggested that it seemed to him, from what he had just seen of the church books, as if it might be a corrupt form of Byzantine Greek. The bishop shook his head. "The Coptic is a distinct language," he said. 8 Greek letters were added to the Coptic alphabet upon the introduction of Christianity into Egypt, and since that time many Greek words have been imported into the Coptic vocabulary. But the main body of the tongue is Coptic, purely, and it has no radical affinity whatever with the Greek. This was the longest speech we heard him make, and he delivered it with some emphasis. I then asked him if the Coptic was in all respects a dead language, to which he replied that many Coptic words, such as the names of the months and of certain festivals, were still in daily use. This, however, was not quite what I meant, so I put the question in another form, and asked if he thought any fragments of the tongue yet survived among the peasantry. He pondered a moment before replying. "That," he said, "is a question to which it is difficult to give a precise answer, but I think you might yet find in some of the remoter villages an old man here and there who would understand it a little." I thought this a very interesting reply to a very interesting question. After sitting about half an hour, we rose and took leave. The bishop shook hands with us all around, and, but that we protested against it, would have accompanied us to the head of the stairs. This interview was altogether very pleasant. The Copts are said to be sullen in manner, and so bigoted that even a Muslim is less an object of dislike to him than a Christian of any other denomination. However this may be, we saw nothing of it. We experienced, on the contrary, many acts of civility from the Copts with whom we were brought into communication. No traveller in Egypt should, I think, omit being present at a service in a Coptic church. For a Coptic church is now the only place in which one may hear the last utterances of that far-off race, with whose pursuits and pleasures the tomb paintings make us so familiar. We know that great changes have come over the language since it was spoken by Rameses the Great and written by Pentar. We know that the Coptic of today bears to the Egyptian of the Pharaohs some such resemblance, perhaps, as the English of Macaulay bears to the English of Chaucer. Yet it is, at bottom, the tongue of old Egypt, and it is something to hear the last lingering echoes of that ancient speech read by the undoubted descendants of the Egyptian people. In another 50 years or so, the Coptic will in all probability be superseded by the Arabic in the services of this church, and then the very tradition of its pronunciation will be lost. The Copts themselves, it is said, are fast going over to the dominant faith. Perhaps by the time our own descendants are counting the 2000th anniversary of the Christian era, both Copts and Coptic will be extinct in Egypt. A day or two after this we dropped down to Karnak, where we remained till the end of the week, and on the following Sunday we resumed our downward voyage. If the universe of literature was unconditioned, and the present book was independent of time and space, I would write another chapter here about Karnak. But Karnak, to be fairly dealt by, would ask not a chapter but a volume. So, having already told something of the impression first made upon us by that wilderness of wonders, I will say no more. Chapter 22. Abydos and Cairo, Part 1. Our last weeks on the Nile went by like one long, lazy summer's day. Events now were few. We had outstayed all our fellow travellers. Even the faithful Bagstones had long since vanished northwards, and the Philae was the last dahabeah of the year. Of the great sights of the river, we had only Abydos and Beni Hassan left to see, while for minor excursions, daily walks, and explorations by the way, we had little energy left. For the thermometer was rising higher, and the Nile was falling lower every day, and we should have been more than mortal if we had not felt the languid influences of the glowing Egyptian spring. The natives call it spring, but to our northern fancy it is spring, summer, and autumn in one. Of the splendor of the skies, of the lavish bounty of the soil at this season, only those who have lingered late in the land can form any conception. There is a breadth of repose now about the landscape which it has never worn before. The winter green of the palms is fading fast. The harvests are ripening, the pigeons are pairing, the time of the singing of birds is come. There is just enough south wind most days to keep the boat straight and the sails from flapping. The heat is great, yet it is a heat which, up to a certain point, one can enjoy. The men ply their oars by night, and sleep under their benches, or croon old songs and tell stories among themselves by day. But for the thin canopy of smoke that hangs over the villages, one would fancy now that those clusters of mud huts were all deserted. Not a human being is to be seen on the banks when the sun is high. The buffaloes stand up to their necks in the shallows. The donkeys huddle together wherever there is shade. The very dogs have given up barking and lie asleep under the walls. The whole face of the country, and even of the Nile, is wonderfully changed since we first passed this way. The land, then newly squared off like a gigantic chessboard and intersected by thousands of little channels, is now one sea of yellowing grain. The river is become a labyrinth of sandbanks, some large, some small, some just beginning to thrust their heads above water, others so long that they divide the river for a mile or more at a stretch. Rais Hassan spends half his life at the prow, poling for shallows, and when we thread our way down one of these sandy straits, it is for all the world like a bit of the Suez Canal. The banks, too, are twice as steep as they were when we went up. The lentil patches, which then blossomed on the slopes next the water's edge, now lie far back on the top of a steep brown ridge, at the foot of which stretches a moist flat planted with watermelons. Each melon plant is protected from the sun by a tiny gable roof of palm thatch. Meanwhile, the river, being low and the banks high, we unfortunates benefit scarcely at all by the faint breezes that now and then ruffle the barley. Day by day, the thermometer, which hangs in the coolest corner of the saloon, creeps up higher and higher, working its way by degrees to above 99°, but never succeeding in getting quite up to 100. We, however, living in semi-darkness, with closed jalousies and wet sails hung round about the sides of the dahabeah, and wet towels hung up in our cabins, find 99° quite warm enough to be pleasant. The upper deck is of course well deluged several times a day, but even so it is difficult to keep the timbers from starting. Meanwhile Elle and the idle man devote their leisure to killing flies, keeping the towels wet, and sprinkling the floors. Our progress all this time is of the slowest. The men cannot row by day, and at night the sandbanks so hedge us in with dangers that the only possible way by which we can make a few miles between sunset and sunrise is by sheer hard punting. Now and then we come to a clear channel, and sometimes we get an hour or two of sweet south breeze, but these flashes of good luck are few and far between. In such wise, and in such a temperature, we found ourselves becalmed one morning within 6 miles of Dendera. Not even Elle could be induced to take a 6-mile donkey ride that day in the sun. The writer, however, ordered out her sketching tent, and paid a last visit to the temple, which, seen among the ripening splendour of miles of barley, looked gloomier and grander and more solitary than ever. 2 or 3 days later we came within reach of Abydos. Our proper course would have been to push on to Beliana, which is one of the recognized starting points for Abydos. But an unlucky sandbank barred the way, so we moored instead at Samara, a village about 2 miles nearer to the southward. Here our dragoman requisitioned the inhabitants for donkeys. As it happened, the harvest had begun in the neighbourhood, and all the beasts of burden were at work, so that it was near midday before we succeeded in getting together the 3 or 4 wretched little brutes, with which we finally started. Not one of these steeds had ever before carried a rider. We had a frightful time with them. My donkey bolted about every 5 minutes. Elle's snarled like a camel and showed its teeth like a dog. The idle man's, bent on flattening its rider, lay down and rolled at short intervals. In this exciting fashion we somehow or another accomplished the 7 miles that separate Samara from Abydos. Skirting some palm groves and crossing the dry bed of a canal, we came out upon a vast plain, level as a lake, islanded here and there with villages, and presenting one undulating surface of bearded corn. This plain, the plain of ancient Thinis, runs parallel with the Nile, like the plain of Thebes, and is bound to the westward by a range of flat-topped mountains. The distance between the river and the mountains, however, is here much greater than at Thebes, being full 6 miles, while to north and south the view ends only with the horizon. Our way lies, at first, by a bridle track through the thick of the barley, then falls into the Beliana road, a raised causeway embanked some 20 feet above the plain. Along this road the country folk are coming and going. In the cleared spaces where the maize has been cut, little encampments of straw huts have sprung up. Yonder, steering their way by unseen paths, go strings of camels, their gawky necks and humped backs undulating above the surface of the corn, like galleys with fantastic prows upon a sea of rippling green. The pigeons fly in great clouds from village to village. The larks are singing and circling madly in the clear depths overhead. The bee-eaters flash like live emeralds across our path. The hoopoes strut by the wayside. At rather more than half-way across the plain we come into the midst of the harvest. Here the brown reapers, bare-legged and naked to the waist, are at work with their sickles, just as they are pictured in the tomb of Ti. The women and children follow, gleaning at the heels of those who bind the sheaves. The sheikh in his black robe and scarlet slippers rides to and fro upon his ass, like Boaz among his people. As the sheaves are bound up, the camels carry them homeward. A camel-load is 14 sheaves, 7 to each side of the hump. A little farther, and the oxen, yoked 2 and 2, are ploughing up the stubble. In a day or two the land will be sown with millet, indigo, or cotton, to be gathered in once more before the coming of the inundation. Meanwhile, as the plain lengthens behind us and the distance grows less between ourselves and the mountains, we see a line of huge irregular mounds reaching for apparently a couple of miles or more along the foot of the cliffs. From afar off the mounds look as if crowned by majestic ruins, but as we draw nearer, these outlines resolve themselves into the village of Arabat el Madfuna, which stands upon part of the mounds of Abydos. And now we come to the end of the cultivated plain, that strange line of demarcation where the inundation stops and the desert begins. Of actual desert, however, there is here but a narrow strip, forming a first step, as it were, above the alluvial plain. Next comes the artificial platform, about a quarter of a mile in depth, on which stands the modern village, and next again, towering up sheer and steep, the great wall of limestone precipice. The village is extensive, and the houses, built in a rustic arabesque, tell of a well-to-do population. Arched gateways, ornamented with black, white, and red bricks, windows of turned lattice-work, and pigeon towers in courses of pots and bricks, give a singular picturesqueness to the place, while the slope down to the desert is covered with shrubberies and palms. Below these hanging gardens, on the edge of the desert, lies the cut corn in piles of sheaves. Here the camels are lying down to be unladen. Yonder the oxen are already treading out the grain, or chopping the straw by means of a curious sledge-like machine set with revolving rows of circular knives. Meanwhile, fluttering from heap to heap, settling on the sheaves, feeding unmolested in the very midst of the threshing floors, strutting all over the margin of the desert, trailing their wings, ruffling their plumes, cooing, curtsying, kissing, courting, filling the air with sweet sounds and setting the whole lovely idyll to a pastoral symphony of their own composing, are thousands and tens of thousands of pigeons. Now our path turns aside and we thread our way among the houses, noticing here a sculptured block built into a mud wall, yonder, beside a dried-up well, a broken alabaster sarcophagus, farther on, a granite column still erect, in the midst of a palm garden. And now, the village being left behind, we find ourselves at the foot of a great hill of newly excavated rubbish, from the top of which we presently look down into a kind of crater, and see the great temple of Abydos at our feet. It was now nearly 3 o'clock, so having seen what we could in the time, and having before us a long ride through a strange country, we left again at 6. I will not presume to describe the temples of Abydos, one of which is so ruined as to be almost unintelligible, and the other so singularly planned and so obscure in its general purport as to be a standing puzzle to archaeologists, after a short visit of 3 hours. Enough if I sketch briefly what I saw, but cursorily. Buried as it is, Abydos, even under its mounds, is a place of profound historical interest. At a time so remote that it precedes all written record of Egyptian story, there existed a little way to the northward of this site a city called Teni. We know not to what aboriginal community of prehistoric Egypt this city belonged, but here presumably the men of Kem built their first temple, evolved their first notions of art, and groped their way to an alphabet which in its origin was probably a mere picture-writing, like the picture-writing of Mexico. Hence, too, came a man named Mina, whose cartouche from immemorial time has stood first in the long list of Egyptian pharaohs. Of Mina, a shadowy figure hovering on the borderland of history and tradition, we know only that he was the first primitive chieftain who took the title of King of Upper and Lower Egypt, and that he went northward and founded Memphis. Not, however, till after some centuries was the seat of government removed to the new city. Teni, the supposed burial place of Osiris, then lost its political importance, but continued to be for long ages the holy city of Egypt. In the meanwhile, Abydos had sprung up close to Teni. Abydos, however, though an important city, was never the capital of Egypt. The seat of power shifted strangely with different dynasties, being established now in the Delta, now at Thebes, now at Elephantine, but having once departed from the site which, by reason of its central position, and the unbounded fertility of its neighbourhood, was above all others best fitted to play this great part in the history of the country, it never again returned to the point from which it had started. That point, however, was unquestionably the centre from which the great Egyptian people departed upon its wonderful career. Here was the nursery of its strength. Hence it derived its proud title to an unmixed, autochthonous descent. For no greater proof of the native origin of the race can be adduced than the position which their first city occupies upon the map of Egypt. That any tribe of colonists should have made straight for the heart of the country, and there have established themselves in the midst of barbarous and probably hostile aborigines, is evidently out of the question. It is, on the other hand, equally clear that if Egypt had been colonized from Asia or Ethiopia, the strangers would on the one hand have founded their earliest settlement in the neighbourhood of the isthmus, or on the other have halted first among the well-watered plains of Nubia. But the Egyptians started from the fertile heart of their own mother country, and began by being great at home. Abydos and Teni, planted on the same platform of desert, were probably united at one time by a straggling suburb inhabited by the embalmers and other tradesfolk concerned in the business of death and burial. A chain of mounds, excavated only where the temples were situated, now stands to us for the famous city of Abydos. An ancient crude brick enclosure and an artificial tumulus mark the site of Teni. The temples and the tumulus, divided by the now exhausted necropolis, are about as distant from one another as Medinet Habu and the Ramesseum. There must have been many older temples at Abydos than these which we now see, one of which was built by Seti I, and the other by Rameses II. Or possibly, as in so many instances, the more ancient buildings were pulled down and rebuilt. Be this as it may, the Temple of Seti, as regards its sculptured decorations, is one of the most beautiful of Egyptian ruins, and as regards its plan, is one of the most singular. A row of square limestone piers, which must once have supported an architrave, are now all that remains of the façade. Immediately behind these comes a portico of 24 columns leading by 7 entrances to a hall of 36 columns. This hall again opens into 7 parallel sanctuaries, behind which lie another hall of columns and a number of small chambers. Adjoining this block, however, and leading from it by doorways at the southern end of the great hall, come several more halls and chambers connected by corridors, and conducting apparently to more chambers not yet excavated. All these piers, columns, halls, and passages, and all the 7 sanctuaries, are most delicately sculptured and brilliantly coloured. There is so far a family resemblance between temples of the same style and period, that after a little experience one can generally guess before crossing the threshold of a fresh building what one is likely to see in the way of sculptures within. But almost every subject in the Temple of Seti at Abydos is new and strange. All the gods of the Egyptian pantheon seem to have been worshipped here, and to have had each his separate shrine. The walls are covered with paintings of these shrines and their occupants, while before each the king is represented performing some act of adoration. A huge blue frog, a greyhound, a double-headed goose, a human-bodied creature with a nilometer for its head, and many more that I can now remember, are thus depicted. The royal offerings, too, though incense and necklaces and pectoral ornaments abound, are for the most part of a kind we have not seen before. In one place the king presents to Isis a column with 4 capitals, having on the top capital a globe and 2 asps surmounted by a pair of ostrich feathers. Chapter 22. Abydos and Cairo, Part 2. The centre sanctuary of the 7 appears to be dedicated to Khem, who seems to be here, as in the great Temple of Seti at Karnak, the presiding divinity. In this principal sanctuary, which is resplendent with colour and marvellous preservation, we especially observe a portrait of Rameses II in the act of opening a door of a shrine by means of a golden key, formed like a human hand and arm. The lock seems to consist of a number of bolts of unequal length, each of which is pushed back in turn by means of the forefinger of the little hand. This doubtless gives a correct representation of the kind of locks in use at that time. It was in a corridor opening out from the great hall in this temple that Mariette discovered that precious sculpture known as the New Tablet of Abydos. In this tableau, Seti I and Rameses II are seen, the one offering incense, the other reciting a hymn of praise, to the names of 76 pharaohs, beginning with Mina and ending with Seti himself. To our great disappointment, though one cannot but acquiesce in the necessity for precaution, we found the entrance to this corridor closed and moulded up. A ragged old Arab who haunts the temple in the character of custode told us that the tablet could now only be seen by special permission. We seemed to have been here about half an hour when the guide came to warn us of approaching evening. We had yet the site and the great tumulus of Teni to see, the tumulus being distant about 20 minutes' ride. The guide shook his head, but we insisted on going. The afternoon had darkened over, and for the first time in many months a gathering canopy of cloud shut out the glory of sunset. We, however, mounted our donkeys and rode northwards. With better beasts we might have perhaps gained our end. As it was, seeing that it grew darker every moment, we presently gave in, and instead of trying to push on farther, contented ourselves with climbing a high mound which commanded the view towards Teni. The clouds by this time were fast closing round, and waves of shadows were creeping over the plain. To our left rose the near mountain barrier, dusk and lowering; to our right stretched the misty cornflats; at our feet, all hillocks and open graves, lay the desolate necropolis. Beyond the palms that fringed the edge of the desert, beyond a dark streak that marked the site of Teni, rose, purple in shadow against the twilight, a steep and solitary hill. This hill, called by the natives Khamis Sultan, or the Mound of the King, was the tumulus we so desired to see. Viewed from a distance, and by so uncertain a light, it looked exactly like a volcanic cone of perhaps a couple of 100 feet in height. It is, however, wholly artificial, and consists of a mass of graves heaped one above another in historical strata, each layer, as it were, the record of an era, the whole a kind of human coral reef built up from age to age with the ashes of generations. For some years past the Egyptian government had been gradually excavating this extraordinary mound. The lower it was opened, the more ancient were its contents. So steadily retrogressive indeed were the interments that it seemed as if the spade of the digger might possibly strike tombs of the first dynasty, and so restore to light relics of men who lived in the age of Mina. According to Plutarch, wrote Mariette, wealthy Egyptians came from all parts of Egypt to be buried at Abydos, in order that their bones might rest near Osiris. Very probably the tombs of Khamis Sultan belonged to those personages mentioned by Plutarch. Nor is this the only interesting attachment to the mound of Khamis Sultan. The famous tomb of Osiris cannot be far distant, and certain indications lead us to think that it is excavated in precisely that foundation of rock which serves as the nucleus of this mound. Thus the persons buried in Khamis Sultan lay as near as possible to the divine tomb. The works now in progress at this point have therefore a twofold interest. They may yield tombs more and more ancient, tombs even of the first dynasty, and some day or other they may discover to us the hitherto unknown and unknown entrance to the tomb of the god. I bitterly regretted at the time that I could not at least ride to the foot of Khamis Sultan, but I think now that I prefer to remember it as I saw it from afar off, clothed with mystery, in the gloom of that dusky evening. There was a heavy silence in the air, and a melancholy as of the burden of ages. The tumbled hillocks looked like a ghastly sea, and beyond the verge of the desert it was already night. Presently, from among the grave pits there crept towards us a slowly moving cloud. As it drew nearer, soft, filmy, shifting, unreal, it proved to be the dust raised by an immense flock of sheep. On they came, a brown, compact mass, their shepherds showing dimly now and then through openings in the cloud. The last pale gleam from above caught them for a moment ere they melted, ghost-like, into the murky plain. Then we went down ourselves, and threaded the track between the mounds and the valley. Palms and houses loomed vaguely out of the dark, and a caravan of camels, stalking by with swift and noiseless footfall, looked like shadows projected on a background of mist. As the night deepened, the air became stifling. There were no stars, and we could scarcely see a yard before us. Crawling slowly along the steep causeway, we felt but could distinguish nothing of the plain stretching away on either side. Meanwhile the frogs croaked furiously, and our donkeys stumbled at every step. When at length we drew near Samada, It was close upon 10 o'clock, and Rais Hassan had just started with men and torches to meet us. Next morning early we once again passed Gerga, with its ruined mosque and still unfallen column, and about noonday moored at a place called Assarat, where we paid a visit to a native gentleman, one Ahmed Abu Ratab Aga, to whom we carried letters of introduction. Ratab Aga owns large estates in this province, is great in horseflesh, and lives in patriarchal fashion surrounded by a numerous clan of kinsfolk and dependents. His residence at Assarat consists of a cluster of 3 or 4 large houses, a score or so of pigeon towers, an extensive garden, stabling, exercising ground, and a large courtyard, the whole enclosed by a wall of circuit and entered by a fine arabesque gateway. He received us in a loggia of lattice-work overlooking the courtyard, and had 3 of his finest horses, a grey, a bay, and a chestnut, brought out for us to admire. They were just such horses as Velasquez loved to paint, thick in the neck, small in the head, solid in the barrel, with wavy manes and long silky tails, set high and standing off straight in true Arab fashion. We doubted, however, that they were altogether pur sang. They looked wonderfully picturesque with their gold-embroidered saddle-cloths, peaked saddles covered with crimson, green, and blue velvet, long shovel stirrups and tasselled headgear. The Aga's brother and nephews put them through their paces. They knelt to be mounted, lay down and died at the word of command, dashed from perfect immobility into a furious gallop, and when at fullest speed stopped short, flung themselves back upon their haunches and stood like horses of stone. We were told that our host had 100 such standing in his stables. Pipes, coffee, and an endless succession of different kinds of sherbets went round all the time our visit lasted, and in the course of conversation we learned that not only the wages of agricultural labourers, but even part of the taxes to the Khedive, are here paid in corn. Before leaving, L., the little lady, and the writer were conducted to the harem, and introduced to the ladies of the establishment. We found them in a separate building with a separate courtyard, living after the usual dreary way of Eastern women, with apparently no kind of occupation, and not even a garden to walk in. The Aga's principal wife, I believe he had but 2, was a beautiful woman, with auburn hair, soft brown eyes, and a lovely complexion. She received us on the threshold, led us into a saloon surrounded by a divan, and with some pride showed us her 5 children. The eldest was a graceful girl of 13, the youngest a little fellow of 4. Mother and daughter were dressed alike, in black robes embroidered with silver, pink velvet slippers on bare feet, silver bracelets and anklets, and full pink Turkish trousers. They wore their hair cut straight across the brow, plaited in long tails behind, and dressed with coins and pendants, while from the back of the head there hung a veil of thin black gauze, also embroidered with silver. Another lady, whom we took for the second wife, and who was extremely plain, had still richer and more massive ornaments, but seemed to hold an inferior position in the harem. There were perhaps a dozen women and girls in all, 2 of whom were black. One of the little boys had been ill all his short life, and looked as if he could not last many more months. The poor mother implored us to prescribe for him. It was in vain to tell her that we knew nothing of the nature of his disease, and had no skill to cure it. She still entreated, and would take no refusal, so in pity we sent her some harmless medicines. We had little opportunity of observing domestic life in Egypt. L. visited some of the vice-regal harems in Cairo, and brought away on each occasion the same impression of dreariness. A little embroidery, a few musical toys of Geneva manufacture, a daily drive on the Shubra road, pipes, cigarettes, sweetmeats, jewellery, and gossip fill up the aimless days of most Egyptian ladies of rank. There are, however, some who take an active interest in politics, and in Cairo and Alexandria the opera boxes of the Khedive and the great pashas are nightly occupied by ladies. But it is not by the daily life of the wives of princes and nobles, but by the life of the lesser gentry and upper middle class, that a domestic system should be judged. These ladies of Assarat had no London-built brougham, no Shrubber road, no opera. They were absolutely without mental resources, and they were even without the means of taking air and exercise. One could see that time hung heavy on their hands, and that they took but a feeble interest in the things around them. The harem stairs were dirty, the rooms were untidy, the general aspect of the place was slatternly and neglected. As for the inmates, though all good nature and gentleness, their faces bore the expression of people who are habitually bored. At Luxor, Ellen the writer paid a visit to the wife of an intelligent and gentlemanly Arab, son of the late governor of that place. This was a middle-class harem. The couple were young and not rich. They occupied a small house, which commanded no view and had no garden. Their little courtyard was given up to the poultry, their tiny terrace above was less than 12 feet square, and they were surrounded on all sides by houses. Yet in this stifling prison the young wife lived, apparently contented from year's end to year's end. She literally never went out. As a child, she had no doubt enjoyed some kind of liberty, but as a marriageable girl and as a bride, she was as much a prisoner as a bird in a cage. Born and bred in Luxor, she had never seen Karnak, yet Karnak is only 2 miles distant. We asked her if she would like to go there with us, but she laughed and shook her head. She was incapable even of curiosity. It seemed to us that the wives of the fellahin were in truth the happiest women in Egypt. They work hard and are bitterly poor, but they have the free use of their limbs, and they at least know the fresh air, the sunshine, and the open fields. When we left Assurat, there still lay 335 miles between us and Cairo. From this time the navigation of the Nile became every day more difficult. The dahabeah, too, got heated through and through, so that not even sluicing and swabbing availed to keep down the temperature. At night, when we went to our sleeping cabins, the timbers alongside of our berths were as hot to the hand as a screen in front of a great fire. Our crew, though to the manner born, suffered even more than ourselves, and Elle at this time had generally a case of sunstroke on her hands. One by one we passed the places we had seen on our way up: Siout, Montfalut, Gebel Abu Faida, Rhoda, Minia. After all, we did not see Beni Hassan. The day we reached that part of the river, a furious sandstorm was raging, such a storm that even the writer was daunted. 3 days later we took the rail at Biba and went on to Cairo, leaving the Philae to follow as fast as wind and weather might permit. We were so wedded by this time to dahabeah life that we felt lost at first in the big rooms at Shepheard's Hotel, and altogether bewildered in the crowded streets. Yet here was Cairo, more picturesque, more beautiful than ever. Here were the same merchants squatting on the same carpets and smoking the same pipes, in the Tunis bazaar. Here was the same old cake seller still ensconced in the same doorway in the Mesquite. Here were the same jewelers selling bracelets in the Khan Khalili, the same money changers sitting behind their little tables at the corners of the streets, the same veiled ladies riding on donkeys and driving in carriages, the same hurrying funerals and noisy weddings, the same odd cries and motley costumes and unaccustomed trades. Nothing was changed. We soon dropped back into the old life of sightseeing and shopping, buying rugs and silks, and silver ornaments, and old embroideries, and Turkish slippers, and all sorts of antique and pretty trifles, going from Mohammedan mosque to rare old Coptic churches, dropping in for an hour or two most afternoons at the Bulak Museum, and generally ending the day's work with a drive on the Shubra Road or a stroll round the Ezbekiya Gardens. Chapter 22. Abydos and Cairo, Part 3. The Mawlid en-Nabi, or Festival of the Birth of the Prophet, was being held at this time in a tract of waste ground along the road to Old Cairo. Here, in some 20 or 30 large open tents, ranged in a circle, there were readings of the Koran and meetings of dervishes going on by day and night, without intermission, for nearly a fortnight. After dark, when the tents were all ablaze with lighted chandeliers, and the dervishes were howling and leaping, and fireworks were being let off from an illuminated platform in the middle of the area, the scene was extraordinary. All Cairo used to be there, on foot or in carriages, between 8 o'clock and midnight every evening, the veiled ladies of the Khedive's harem in their miniature broughams being foremost among the spectators. The Mawlid en Nebi ends with the performance of the dosha, when the Sheikh of the Sadiya dervishes rides over a road of prostrate fanatics. L. and the writer witnessed this sight from the tent of the governor of Cairo. Drunk with opium, fasting and praying, rolling their heads and foaming at the mouth, some hundreds of wretched creatures lay down in the road packed as close as paving stones, and were walked and ridden over before our eyes. The standard-bearers came first, then a priest reading the Koran aloud, then the Sheikh on his white Arab, supported on either side by barefooted priests. The beautiful horse trod with evident reluctance, and as lightly and swiftly as possible, on the human causeway under his hoofs. The Mohammedans aver that no one is injured, or even bruised, on this holy occasion, but I saw some men carried away in convulsions, who looked as if they would never walk again. It is difficult to say but a few inadequate words of a place about which an instructive volume might be written, yet to pass the Bulaq Museum in silence is impossible. This famous collection is due, in the first instance, to the liberality of the late Khedive and the labours of Mariette. With the exception of Mehemet Ali, who excavated the temple of Dendera, no previous viceroy of Egypt had ever interested himself in the archaeology of the country. Those who cared for such rubbish as encumbered the soil or lay hidden beneath the sands of the desert were free to take it, and no favour was more frequently asked or more readily granted than permission to dig for antiquities. Hence the Egyptian wealth of our museums. Hence the numerous private collections dispersed throughout Europe. Ismail Pasha, however, put an end to that wholesale pillage, and for the first time since ever mummy was sold for balsam or for bric-a-brac, it became illegal to export antiquities. Thus, for the first time, Egypt began to possess a national collection. Youngest of great museums, the Bulaq collection is the wealthiest in the world in portrait statues of private individuals, in funerary tablets, in amulets, and in personal relics of the ancient inhabitants of the Nile Valley. It is necessarily less rich in such colossal statues as fill the great galleries of the British Museum, the Turin Museum, and the Louvre. These, being above ground and comparatively few in number, were for the most part seized upon long since, and transported to Europe. The Bulaq statues are the product of the tombs. The famous wooden Sheikh, about which so much has been written, the magnificent diorite statue of Khafra, or Khephren, the builder of the second pyramid, the two marvellous sitting statues of Prince Rahotep and Princess Nefert are all portraits, and, like their tombs, were executed during the lifetime of the persons represented. Crossing the threshold of the great vestibule, one is surrounded by a host of these extraordinary figures, erect, coloured, clothed, all but in motion. It is like entering the crowded anteroom of a royal palace in the time of the ancient empire. The greater number of the Bulaq portrait statues are sculptured in what is called the hieratic attitude, that is, with the left arm down and pressed close to the body, the left hand holding a roll of papyrus, the right leg advanced, and the right hand raised, as grasping the walking staff. It occurred to me that there might be a deeper significance than at first sight appears in this conventional attitude, and that it perhaps suggests the moment of resurrection, when the deceased, holding fast by his copy of the Book of the Dead, walks forth from his tomb into the light of life eternal. Of all the statues here, one may say indeed of all known Egyptian statues, those of Prince Rahotep and Princess Nefert are the most wonderful. They are probably the oldest portrait statues in the world. They come from a tomb of the 3rd dynasty, and are contemporary with Snefru, a king who reigned before the time of Khufu and Khafra. That is to say, these people who sit before us side by side, coloured to the life, fresh and glowing as the day when they gave the artist his last sitting, lived at a time when the great pyramids of Giza were not yet built, and at a date which is variously calculated as from about 6300 to 4000 years before the present day. The princess wears her hair precisely as it is still worn in Nubia, and her necklace of cabochon drops is of a pattern much favoured by the modern Gawazi. The eyes of both statues are inserted. The eyeball, which is set in an eyelet of bronze, is made of opaque white quartz, with an iris of rock crystal enclosing a pupil of some kind of brilliant metal. This treatment, of which there are one or two other instances extant, gives to the eyes a look of intelligence that is almost appalling. There is a play of light within the orb, and apparently a living moisture upon the surface, which has never been approached by the most skilfully made glass eyes of modern manufacture. Of the jewels of Queen Ahotep, of the superb series of engraved scarabæi, of the rings, amulets, and toilette ornaments, of the vases in bronze, silver, alabaster, and porcelain, of the libation tables, the woven stuffs, the terracottas, the artists' models, the lamps, the silver boats, the weapons, the papyri, the 1,001 curious personal relics and articles of domestic use which are brought together within these walls, I have no space to tell. Except the collection of Pompeian relics in Naples, there is nothing elsewhere to compare with the collection at Boulac, and the villas of Pompeii have yielded no such gems and jewels as the tombs of ancient Egypt. It is not too much to say that if these dead and mummied people could come back to earth, the priest would here find all the gods of his pantheon, the king his sceptre, the queen her crown jewels, the scribe his palette, the soldier his arms, the workman his tools, the barber his razors, the husbandman his hoe, the housewife her broom, the child his toys, the beauty her combs and coal bottles and mirrors. The furniture of the house is here, as well as the furniture of the tomb. Here, too, is the broken sistrum buried with the dead in token of the grief of the living. Waiting the construction of a more suitable edifice, the present building gives temporary shelter to the collection. In the meanwhile, if there was nothing else to tempt the traveller to Cairo, the Boulac Museum would alone be worth the journey from Europe. The first excursion one makes on returning to Cairo, the last one makes before leaving, is to Giza. It is impossible to get tired of the pyramids. Here Elle and the writer spent their last day with the happy couple. We left Cairo early, and met all the market folk coming in from the country, donkeys and carts laden with green stuff, and veiled women with towers of baskets on their heads. The Khedive's new palace was swarming already with masons, and files of camels were bringing limestone blocks for the builders. Next comes the open corn plain, part yellow, part green, the long straight road bordered with acacias, beyond all the desert platform, and the pyramids, half in light, half in greyish-green shadow, against the horizon. I could never understand why it is that the second pyramid, though it is smaller and farther off, looks from this point of view bigger than the first. Farther on, the brown fellahin, knee-deep in purple blossom, are cutting the clover. The camels carry it away. The goats and buffaloes feed in the clearings. Then comes the halfway tomb nestled in greenery, where men and horses stay to drink, and soon we are skirting a great backwater which reflects the pyramids like a mirror. Villages, shadoofs, herds and flocks, tracts of palms, cornflats, and spaces of rich, dark fallow now succeed each other, and then once more comes the sandy slope, and the cavernous ridge of ancient yellow rock, and the great pyramid with its shadow side towards us, darkening the light of day. Neither Elle nor the writer went inside the great pyramid. The idle man did so this day, and Elle's maid on another occasion, and both reported of the place as so stifling within, so foul underfoot, and so fatiguing, that somehow we each time put it off, and ended by missing it. The ascent is extremely easy. Rugged and huge as are the blocks, there is scarcely one upon which it is not possible to find a half-way rest for the toe of one's boot, so as to divide the distance. With the help of 3 Arabs, nothing can well be less fatiguing. As for the men, they are helpful and courteous, and as clever as possible, and coax one on from block to block in all the languages of Europe. Pazienza, signora! Allez doucement! All serene! We half-way now. Dem halben Weg, Fräulein. Ne vous pressez pas, mademoiselle. Ci va sano, va lontano. 6 step more, and ecco la cima. You should add the other half of the proverb, amici, said I. Ci va forte, va alla morte. My Arabs had never heard this before, and were delighted with it. They repeated it again and again, and committed it to memory with great satisfaction. I asked them why they did not cut steps in the blocks, so as to make the ascent easier for ladies. The answer was ready and honest. "No, no, mademoiselle. Arab very stupid to do that. If Arab makes good steps, Hawaji goes up alone. No more want Arab man to help him up, and Arab man earn no more dollars." They offered to sing Yankee Doodle when we reached the top, then finding we were English, shouted, "God save the Queen," and told us that the Prince of Wales had given £40 to the Pyramid Arabs when he came here with the Princess 2 years before, which, however, we took the liberty to doubt. The space on the top of the Great Pyramid is said to be 30 feet square. It is not, as I had expected, a level platform. Some blocks of the next tier remain, and 2 or 3 of the tier next above that, so making pleasant seats and shady corners. What struck us most on reaching the top was the startling nearness, to all appearance, of the second pyramid. It seemed to rise up beside us like a mountain, yet so close that I fancied I could almost touch it by putting out my hand. Every detail of the surface, every crack and party-coloured stain in the shining stucco that yet clings about the apex, was distinctly visible. The view from this place is immense. The country is so flat, the atmosphere so clear, the standpoint so isolated, that one really sees more and sees farther than from many a mountain summit of 10 or 12,000 feet. The ground lies, as it were, immediately under one, and the great necropolis is seen as in a ground plan. The effect must, I imagine, be exactly like the effect of a landscape seen from a balloon. Without ascending the pyramid, it is certainly not possible to form a clear notion of the way in which this great burial field is laid out. We see from this point how each royal pyramid is surrounded by its quadrangle of lesser tombs, some in the form of small pyramids, others partly rock-cut, partly built of massive slabs, like the roofing stones of the temples. We see how Khufu and Khafra and Menkaura lay, each under his mountain of stone, with his family and his nobles around him. We see the great causeway which moved Herodotus to such wonder, and along which the giant stones were brought. Recognizing how clearly the place is a great cemetery, one marvels at the ingenious theories which turn the pyramids into astronomical observatories and abstruse standards of measurement. They are the grandest graves in all the world, and they are nothing more. A little way to the southward, from the midst of a sandy hollow, rises the head of the Sphinx. Older than the pyramids, older than history, the monster lies couchant like a watchdog, looking ever to the east, as if for some dawn that has not yet risen. A depression in the sand close by marks the site of that strange monument miscalled the Temple of the Sphinx. Farther away to the west, on the highest slope of this part of the desert platform, stands the pyramid of Menkaura, Mycerinus. It has lost but 5 feet of its original height, and from this distance it looks quite perfect. Such, set in a waste of desert, are the main objects, and the nearest objects on which our eyes first rest. As a whole, the view is more long than wide, being bounded to the westward by the Libyan range, and to the eastward by the Makatam hills. At the foot of those yellow hills, divided from us by the cultivated plain across which we have just driven, lies Cairo, all glittering domes half seen through a sunlit haze. Overlooking the fairy city stands the mosque of the citadel, its mast-like minarets piercing the clearer atmosphere. Far to the northward, traversing reach after reach of shadowy palm groves, the eye loses itself in the dim and fertile distances of the delta. To the west and south all is desert. It begins here at our feet, a rolling wilderness of valleys and slopes and rivers and seas of sand, broken here and there by abrupt ridges of rock, and mounds of ruined masonry, and open graves. A silver line skirts the edge of this dead world, and vanishes southward in the sun mist that shimmers on the farthest horizon. To the left of that silver line we see the quarried cliffs of Tura, marble white, opposite Tura the plumy palms of Memphis. On the desert platform above, clear though faint, the pyramids of Abusir and Saqqara and Dashur. Every stage of the pyramid of Osinephes, banded in light and shade, is plain to see. So is the dome-like summit of the Great Pyramid of Dashur. Even the brick ruin beside it, which we took for a black rock as we went up the river, and which looks like a black rock still, is perfectly visible. Farthest of them all, showing pale and sharp amid the palpitating blaze of noon, stands like an unfinished Tower of Babel the Pyramid of Medum. It is in this direction that our eyes turn oftenest, to the measureless desert in its mystery of light and silence, to the Nile where it gleams out again and again, till it melts at last into that faint, far distance beyond which lie Thebes and Philae and Abu Simbel.